Today I'm speaking with Dr. Steve Mason. Dr. Mason, thank you so much for joining me again today.
Pleasure.
And I've spoken with Dr. Mason now 2 other times, and I'll have the links to those videos beneath this video. And it is just an absolute privilege every time to speak with Dr. Mason. He is a wealth of knowledge, and I wanted to give everyone a brief background, just in case you haven't heard of his work before. He is a historian of the ancient Eastern Mediterranean world, specifically under Roman rule, circa 200 BCE to 400 CE, with a focus on Roman Judea. He has extensively studied the Jewish historian Flavius Josephus and Christian-Jewish-Roman relations, and he's authored and edited numerous books and articles on Josephus. He earned his bachelor's and master's in religious studies from McMaster University in Canada, and while earning his PhD, he spent a year at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and another at the University of Tübingen, one of Germany's top universities, focusing on ancient Judaism and early Christianity. He then earned his PhD at Toronto's St. Michael's College, with his dissertation being on the works of Josephus. And after teaching for 2 years at the Memorial University of Newfoundland in Canada, he spent the next 22 in Toronto's York University, shifting from the Division of Humanities to the Department of History, and from teaching Christian origins in ancient Judaism to holding a Tier 1 Canada Research Chair in Greco-Roman cultural interaction. In 1995, he was the head of Classics and Ancient Mediterranean Studies at the Pennsylvania State University, after which he returned to York University. And in 2011, he took up the Kirby Lang Chair in New Testament in Aberdeen, Scotland, during which he spent a year in Berlin with the Humboldt Research Prize and half a year in Groningen as the first Dirk Smelde Visiting Fellow. And I'll wrap this up here because there's a lot more I could say, but he was a professor of classics, history and religious studies, and the research chair, again at York University, and again Aberdeen University. But then since 2015, this is where we're up to today, he has been the distinguished professor of ancient Mediterranean religions and cultures in the Faculty of Theology and Religious Studies at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands, which is a 400-year-old university and one of the top 100 large comprehensive research universities in the world. Again, lots more I could say, but I'll end that intro there. But I did want to just list his books as well, because this is very relevant to what we're saying today. And this list may be outdated. Feel free to add if I forget any. A History of the Jewish War, Orientation to the History of Roman Judea, Flavius Josephus and Flavian Rome, Life of Josephus, Josephus and the New Testament, Early Christian Reader, Josephus, Judea and Christian Origins, Flavius Josephus Translation and Commentary, Understanding Josephus, 7 Perspectives, and Flavius Josephus on the Pharisees. Does that cover all of them as far as you remember?
I don't. Did you mention the book on the war?
History of the Jewish War?
Yeah.
Yeah, I got that one. Okay.
Okay, so I missed that one. I just heard a lot of Josephus.
Yeah.
I guess I'd like your viewers to know that fundamentally I'm a historian, but my concern is that in doing history, we understand our evidence. So I focused a lot on Josephus, but in context, this book on the war is really about the war. It's not just about Josephus. It's bringing in everything else having to do with the war as well, archaeology and coins and inscriptions and so on. Yeah.
And is that referring to the Maccabean revolt?
No, it's the war against Rome
Okay.
in Judea in 66 to 74. So it's the one that saw the destruction of the temple, the destruction of Jerusalem in the year 70.
Gotcha.
And the book investigates the causes of the war, how the war developed. It's largely a work of military history in addition to anything else. Yeah.
That's awesome. I've picked up 2 or 3 of those books, and I'm just getting started. I'm definitely in over my head. But what I appreciate about Dr. Mason, and I think everyone will agree with me here very shortly, is that Dr. Mason does an awesome job of taking very deep subjects and putting them on a level that even new students can pick up. And I appreciate that so much. And what we're going to talk about today is actually right on target for what Dr. Mason focuses on. I want to start with this text and then take us in. About this time, there lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man. For he was one who performed surprising deeds and was a teacher of such people as accept the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many of the Greeks. He was the Messiah. And when, upon the accusation of the principal men among us, Pilate had condemned him to a cross, those who had first come to love him did not cease. He appeared to them, spending a 3rd day restored to life, for the prophets of God had foretold these things, and 1,000 other marvels about him, and the tribe of the Christians, so called after him, has still to this day not disappeared. Josephus Antiquities 1833. What is that passage? And take us in. What is it all about? What's happening there?
Well, it's one of the most famous passages for obvious reasons in Josephus's writings. So for viewers who may not have remembered this, I'll remind you that Josephus actually wrote 30 volumes of history. So 20 volumes in this work called the Antiquities. And this comes in book 18 of the Antiquities. But he'd already written 7 volumes of the Jewish war against Rome. And then he would write 3 more volumes later, an autobiography and then a 2-volume essay. So this is his major work. And in book 18, he's describing the tenure of Pontius Pilate, a very famous figure, a Roman governor, sort of a low-ranking Roman governor. So you have two levels of Roman governor. You have the very big shot guys who are the senators. And there's one of them in Syria, the province of Syria. So the entire Eastern Mediterranean littoral, the Levant, is run by this guy. But he's based way, way north up in Antioch, which is now in Turkey. It's so far north in Syria. And there's a kind of junior position of governor, which doesn't go to a senator, but to an equestrian. That means a lower level nobility in Rome. And this is Pontius Pilate. So he's a very famous guy. And he held a very long term as governor, based along the coast in a town called Caesarea, or Caesarea Maritima, coastal Caesarea, to distinguish it from other Caesareas. This is where Pilate is serving as Roman governor. And this part of Josephus's narrative is all about a few stories from the time of Pontius Pilate. Now, the other stories tend to be disturbances that Pilate bombed, ended, quashed. One has to do with an aqueduct that he fixed or built. It's not clear exactly what he did, repaired or added to the aqueduct. And this caused some kind of revolt, some riot, because he used funds, presumably with the support of temple leadership. He used funds from the temple. That is, the temple serves as a kind of bank in Jerusalem, and he used some funds from that to fund this aqueduct, which, you know, from a Roman point of view, makes perfect sense. Like, this is a good thing for the locals to have an aqueduct. Everybody wants to get a functioning aqueduct. And there were a couple of aqueducts coming into Jerusalem. So it's not clear exactly what he did, but somehow in his aqueduct project, he managed to ruffle some feathers, and there was some kind of riot and people got killed. So that's one of the things. And then the other one, the other major one, was that he, you know, the military force that he had at his disposal, an auxiliary force that is not Roman legionaries, not Roman citizens, they always carried, you know, like most military units do, they're very proud of their traditions, and they carry these, you know, banners with insignia on them, and some of those insignia have images, images of animals, images of the emperor, and so this unit that rotated into Jerusalem as the garrison wanted to bring its images in, and the text says that Pilate did it by night and had the images covered up. Why? Because the Jews of Jerusalem had a thing about not having images around of people or animals, because, you know, the old idea was people might worship those. And in other towns, and in Egypt, for example, and other places, people were worshiping these or using them as kind of icons for worship. So in Judea, because the idea was so strong that you can't make an image of God, this was, you know, verboten. And this also caused a riot once it was discovered that these images had been brought in. So those are the kind of surrounding main stories. And Josephus then goes off to Rome to talk about a story that happened well, not exactly at the same time, roughly at the same time. Maybe Pilate had a very long tenure. It's possible that he was in office for like 18 years. The reason I mention that is if he was in office for 18 years, then that first story that's told about in Rome at the same time, Josephus says, could make sense because it happened, we know it happened in 19 CE or 19 AD, this story. So anyhow, that's the kind of framing of what's going on. And right in the middle of this is the story you just read, Tim, about, around this time or at this time, in the very same period when Pilate was governor, is this guy, there comes a guy named Jesus, a wise man, if you can really call him a man, and then it goes on like this. So the question is, of course, did Josephus really write all of this? And it becomes an issue because, as your readers will, or your viewers will likely know, Josephus's works were preserved by Christians. That may sound sinister, but I have to immediately add that, of course, pretty much everything from the ancient world that was preserved either by Christians or by Muslims in Arabic, and or maybe the Muslims first preserved it and then the Christians got it from them, like in Aristotle in the 12th century. But there was nobody else around. I mean, they're the only game in town. So if you write things in the ancient world, they disappear. I mean, whatever you write on, papyrus, parchment, and so on, it's most likely going to disappear within a few hundred years, unless it's kept in a dry place and under certain conditions, it might survive. And some stuff has survived from the ancient world, so we're very grateful. But the vast majority of what people would write would, disappear. I mean, one of the big finds we have is a rubbish dump place called Oxyrhynchus in Egypt. And, thousands of bills and receipts and things like that were discovered all of a sudden, which is amazing, right? But that was in the end of the 19th century, these were discovered. But they were not preserved, right? They were discovered by being kind of buried and sheltered. So the point is, the vast majority of what people would write disappeared. Even some of Paul's letters in the New Testament, we know, disappeared. And this is a famous guy in early Christianity, but some of his letters disappeared. We know that because he refers to them. In one of his very first letters, he talks about my previous letter. What letter is that? We don't have it. So we know that a huge amount of stuff disappeared. And things are only going to be preserved if people copy them. So the fact is that Josephus's works were preserved by Christians after about the 4th century for sure. Christians are recopying this stuff out. So the earliest manuscripts we have of Josephus are from the 10th century. That is to say, all the earlier ones, obviously there were earlier copies he wrote in the 1st century, but all the intervening copies have disappeared. So we have the Greek manuscripts that we use are from the 10th century and later until the printing press in the 15th century. So you have like 500 years of copying handwritten manuscripts. And then, of course, from the printing press onward, no problem, because everything is just, secure. But it's in that interval, first of all, the first 900 years when things were copied and we have no idea what happened. And then in the next 400 or 500 years of hand copying before the printing press, there's a lot of room in there for things to get changed. And
some are in different languages too, right?
Sorry?
And some are in different languages, correct?
Well, there were also, then there's a Latin translation of Josephus. There's even from the 10th century onward, a Hebrew version of Josephus that mixes in Josephus with other texts and different texts of Josephus, all in the same work called the Yosipon, the Sefer Yosipon. And that becomes very, very popular in the Jewish community.
Can I ask a real quick question regarding Josephus? Just I probably should have asked this earlier, but just to give a really quick, short, I don't want to stop your train of thought too much, but just for anyone that for whatever reason isn't too familiar with Josephus, they know kind of he's a historian of the time of Christ, but just could you give us a little bit more, like what, in the sense of like, was he known as a Christian? Was he known as a Pharisee? Like what was his background historically, as far as you know?
Yeah,
Just real
actually,
short.
yeah, pretty good clues about him, because he says he's not all that shy to talk about himself. You know, most ancient writers don't, in fact, many ancient texts don't even name their author at all, but he's quite happy to name himself because he's quite proud of his achievements. First of all, he survived. So let me tell you a little bit about him.
Please.
I know you know, Tim. For your viewers, I'll just add in a little reminder. So he's born in the year 37. This is the year that Gaius Caligula becomes emperor. He's born in Jerusalem, and he's born evidently of a priestly caste. So in Jerusalem, in Judea, the priests are not unlike in Rome and Greece, where ordinary people who become politicians would also become priests. That's not how it works in Judea. In Judea, as in Egypt and in other parts of the East, the priests are a caste. They are hereditary aristocracy. So in the Bible, this is attributed to there being a subset of one of the tribes, the biblical tribes. And they are, because they have a special function in the temple, slaughtering animals and following the rituals that, you know, are prescribed in the Bible for worshiping God, they are not supposed to be engaged in business and agriculture and ordinary stuff. So the rest of the people support them by paying what's called a tithe, which is a tenth. A tenth of their income goes to the tribe of the Levites, and then the Levites give a tenth to the priests, who are a subset of this tribe of Levi or Levi. Levites, people will know from the New Testament. Anyhow, so that's what Josephus is. He's born this way, and his family is apparently quite kind of wealthy and comfortable in Jerusalem, because they're part of this hereditary aristocracy. So he receives a very good education, learns Greek as well as Hebrew and Aramaic, and he is already in his 20s, in his mid-20s. He's sent on a mission to Rome to try to free some prisoners that have been sent to Rome, some other priests, some kind of, whether he knew them personally or they were part of his circle, broader circle, we don't know. But he respects them and wants them freed. He says they were real gentlemen. They were, you know, good chaps, and they were sent on some, he says, trifling, frivolous charge. Could have been quite serious, but he says it was a small charge. And they were kept in Nero's, now the Emperor Nero's power in the 60s. 63, 64, that's when Josephus goes off to Rome. Now he says he was shipwrecked, and he had a magnificent feat of Olympic caliber swimming to save himself. He swam all night. How he learned to swim, nobody knows, because he lived in landlocked Judea. But anyhow, claims that he swam and outswam a bunch of other people who just drowned from the ship, and he made it, and he rescued these three priests, not from Nero. He didn't get to see Nero probably, but through Nero's wife, Poppaea, who may have had a thing for him. He might imply, it's not clear. Anyhow, she sent him away with magnificent gifts, and as well as managing to free his friends. So he somehow, I mean, he couldn't really have made all this stuff. The shipwreck, maybe, swimming, maybe, but he's some kind of a player. He's some kind of a mover and a shaker. And then when he gets back to Jerusalem, I said I was going to be brief, but I can get carried away with this stuff.
No, this is good info. It's great.
Anyhow, he gets back to Jerusalem, and by now, the tensions are building with the local Roman governor, who is no longer Pontius Pilate. The governor now, the low-level governor, is a guy named Gessius Florus, who comes in year 65. And this guy apparently has been sent by Nero. Nero's a very young fellow. He became emperor at age 16, which is probably too young to be, master of the world. You remember back to when you were 16. certainly I at 16. Anyway, he shouldn't have had so much power, but he somehow got himself into terrible financial straits. Nero did. And now, so he comes to power in 54. So now he's like 54 AD, CE. So he's now like 20, getting into his late 20s. And he's in desperate financial shape. And it seems like he was instructing all of his governors and procurators, who are kind of financial agent, to raid temples, not just in Jerusalem, but everywhere. Because temples are, as I said before, kind of banks, places where people's money is supposed to be safe because they are sacred sites. So the temple in Jerusalem is known to be very, very wealthy. The reason for that is it's the only one for Jews. Like they don't have temples like followers of Athena or Zeus have temples all over the place. Every town has one. So every temple is a local temple. For Jews all around the world, and that is the Mediterranean and in the Parthian world, Iran and Iraq today in the East, they all send money to the one temple in Jerusalem. So this guy thinks, hey, this is like a gravy train here. Rob the temple in Jerusalem, and we're golden, right? We've got lots and lots of money there. Anyway, of course, this stirs up massive resentment, revolt against this governor and the auxiliary army. So to make a long story short, now if I can still do that, Josephus is a big enough shot, a big enough banana, that he is sent, there's a lot of violence breaks out now. The guy in the north, that big shot governor, now brings a legion down to Jerusalem to try to calm the troubles. That legion is ambushed on its way home and just mostly destroyed by these irate Judeans. And now there's some serious reckoning going to happen, and everybody in Jerusalem knows that, and they're kind of sitting on tenterhooks waiting for the Romans now to respond to this huge humiliation of having a legion vested in the valley, in the pass at Beit Horon. So anyhow, in that context, Josephus is sent as one of several people sent to different regions to try to, well, it's not clear to try to do what, because he gives two different accounts of this. In the war, he says, I was sent as a general to raise an army to defend Galilee, the northern part of Judea, or of the Judean region, against where the Romans would probably come from to exact retaliation, because they expected the same governor who had his legion whomped, he would go back up north to Antioch, and he would come back with more legions to take vengeance. That's what people were expecting. So Galilee was kind of right in the line of fire, line of travel. So that's what he says in war. He was sent to fortify all the sites and to raise an army to help defend Galilee. In his life, his autobiography, called the Vita, Latin term, he says he gives a different story. He says, I went there with two other priests to actually try to calm things down, to persuade people, if they were getting antsy with their weapons, to put their weapons down and wait and see what the Romans did. And we should keep the weapons for the trained fighters. So it's quite a different story, actually. In one place, he's bigging himself up, saying, I was sent as a great general. And the other place, I was sent as a kind of peacemaker. Most scholars think the second explanation is closer to the truth in the nature of things, because he claims in the war account that he raised an army of 100,000 soldiers. This is unbelievable. That's like bigger than the Canadian army, for example, just from Galilee. So it's easier to believe that he went there to just kind of get the lay of the land and try to calm everything down and get everybody on side. Anyway, that's Josephus. He was caught when the Romans did show up in Galilee, and here's a very important point. he's usually viewed as a kind of traitor. Turncoat is the term you'll most often find pinned on Josephus. But I think it's clear. I mean, I wouldn't say it's a fact, but it's pretty clear that he's one of the very few people in this conflict that actually put himself in harm's way. That is to say, when the Romans arrived, he skedaddled for the lake of Tiberias, the Kinneret Lake, known as the Sea of Galilee in the Gospels. And, he's sitting there in the cafe there, enjoying himself far away from the Roman line of advance. But he has friends in a small town in Galilee called Jodafat or Jotapata. And he actually left his place of security to go and try to help this little town. It didn't work out. And he was arrested. He was seized. The story is that everybody around him committed suicide. He wasn't really into that. So he either concocted a way or was lucky enough to survive. He has a story about how he was presented to the Roman general, Vespasian, and his son Titus. And he made a statement that's usually viewed as a prediction. But in the Greek, it's not a prediction. He just says he says it like this. The Roman general says, okay, I'm going to send you to Nero to face trial because you're like an enemy combatant. And he says, send me to Nero. Now, remember, this guy was shipwrecked last time he went to see Nero, and it was like within an inch of his life that he survived, even getting to Nero, let alone what Nero would do to him. So he's not keen on the idea of going to Nero. And he says, why are you sending me to Nero? Like you're the emperor. You're Caesar, you and your son here, Titus. Now, this has usually been viewed as a prediction of his. And then the question is, well, he obviously didn't make a prediction. That doesn't happen. So, this is some kind of fabricated story. I think it's possible that he said something along this line. He made some kind of deal with Vespasian. Look, please don't send me to Nero. I think you're what do you think about Nero? Really, seriously, this young boy who's emperor, you're the man. Vespasian was like 56 years old at this point and a very accomplished general. So it's not beyond the realm of possibility that Josephus said something more like, hey, I really think you should be emperor. And I can even tell you that, in our sacred texts, there's stories about a ruler coming from the east and this kind of thing. So it could be that's what happened. We don't know. But anyway, he survived. He was a survivor among whatever else you want to say about him. He survived. I don't think we should hold that against him. He's the one who tells us the story. It doesn't look so good in retrospect, but he survived, and we're glad that he did, because then a year later, not after his surrender, but a year after the destruction of Jerusalem, he goes with Titus, the guy who besieged and destroyed Jerusalem, the son of the now emperor Vespasian, travels with him back to Rome, and he spends the balance of his life in Rome, writing, however, not about how great the Romans are, but writing about the history of his own people and saying that the Judeans have been widely misunderstood, misrepresented as kind of, lowlifes and people who rebelled against the Romans. It's not true. He says, we have the highest virtues, the highest values. And in fact, even some of what he says about the Judeans could look bad for the Romans by comparison. So he's very much a kind of, we might say today, a nationalist writer, trying to exalt the great traditions of the Jews. You asked whether he was a Pharisee or Christian or whatever. He's not a Christian, and that has to do with what we're looking at today. He's definitely not a Christian. And I wrote a book arguing he was not a Pharisee either. That was the common view 30 years ago, that Josephus was a Pharisee. We can't get into it now, but there's one sentence in his autobiography that was read that way, as if he said, I joined the Pharisees. I argued, took me a whole book to argue. Well, it's not just about that passage. It's about, how the Pharisees function in his writings, to argue that he didn't really like the Pharisees at all. And that one sentence should be read differently. It's not that he became a Pharisee, but he's saying, I began political life. And being a politician in Jerusalem meant following the rules of the Pharisees because they were the popular party. Their rules, their way of interpreting the laws, their legal system was the popular one. And you couldn't really function as a politician unless you followed the way the Pharisees interpreted the laws.
Can I ask, with the Pharisee thing, is there any evidence that he was involved with the Qumran community at all, with the group that wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls?
No. He doesn't mention anything about Qumran or, of course, what we call the scrolls. He does mention a group called the Essenes, which he really, really likes.
But he wasn't part of them, apparently.
Well, he implies that he says in his autobiography that I studied the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes.
Okay.
Because I wanted to understand, all the philosophical schools, that he calls them. But then he says I wasn't really happy with any of them, and I found this guy, this teacher named Panos, and I lived with him for like 3 years, a philosopher, and this guy was the business. He was very, very simple and straight, and I really liked him. But when I got to 19 years old, I had to go back to the city, Polis, and begin to engage in political life. So I had to give up my youthful, philosophical quest. So yeah, he really likes the Essenes very much. But well, first of all, we shouldn't, I think, identify the Essenes with Qumran scrolls.
Right.
Here I part company with a number of scholars. The prevailing view has been that Qumran was a site of Essenes and Essene scroll production. I simply think there's no reason to connect those two things.
Sure. But
that's a subject for another time.
Yeah, but at least we know he wasn't there as some kind of Qumran community leader. That wasn't what his history shows.
No, he's part of the reason for me not to identify them is he's a very proud establishment man. He's a very proud priest from Jerusalem. And at least the general view of the scrolls by scholars, this is a little bit changing now, but the general view has been that they're sort of anti-Jerusalem priests. If anything, they really don't like the establishment and see it as degenerate and sinful and all of that. Well, in that kind of opposition, Josephus would definitely be on the side of the sinful, rotten priestly group in Jerusalem. He's a very proud member of the Jerusalem establishment.
Gotcha. So that does bring it up the interesting question here of I think what drives people to wonder about the whole topic we're about to dive into here with this testimonium is when he says he was the Messiah. By the way, could you explain why is it called Testimonium Flavianum? What does that refer to?
In classics, generally, in ancient history, we just call titles by their Latin names, titles of books. And then if anything weird happens, we give it a Latin name as well. This passage is just like, so it's called in Latin, the Testimonium, which means like a witness, testimony, witness. Flavianum. Flavianum is kind of an adjective meaning the Flavian. But that's only because Josephus became known once he was given his freedom as a Roman citizen. He became, so his native name was Joseph, son of Mattathiau, or Matthew or Matthias. That's his dad's name. And that's how he was known in Judea. But once he became a Roman citizen, he would have been called Titus Flavius Josephus. Titus Flavius Josephus. So he would keep the Joseph part now with the Latin ending on it, Josephus, because that's the masculine ending of a Latin name. And then, but he doesn't call himself that. He only ever calls himself Josephus or Joseph. That's all he ever says of himself. But later writers called him Flavius Josephus. Like Eusebius calls him that, and a couple of earlier writers than Eusebius in the 4th century call him this. So we could have guessed that anyway, because when you become a Roman citizen, you have to take a 3-part name plus a tribal name, but you take a 3-part name. And usually you take the name, well, pretty much always take the name of the people who give you your freedom. And so since they were Titus Flavius Vespasianus, both father and son had the same name. So we call one Vespasian and one Titus, but that's only so that we can tell them apart. They had exactly the same name, like Junior, we would say. And so Josephus would be Titus Flavius, and then with his name stuck on the end, Josephus. So because he was known as Flavius Josephus, this became known as the Testimonium Flavianum by Christians. That is the Flavians' the witness or testimony to Jesus,
Right.
his witness about Jesus. Yeah.
And could I just ask this or add this, that one of the reasons that this is important is because there's not much that's said about Jesus by other historians that you would expect, and a lot of the other historians that come later that say, that there was a man named Jesus and there were Christians, they're coming so late that they're more like, it's more like the later historians are putting it in the context of there are Christians and they're claiming that they're following from what happened 50, 100 years ago of this guy named Christ, but they're not actually testifying that they physically saw it as a historian. So it's more just like those later historians are proof that there are Christians around, but not about whatever the real Christ is. So this becomes very critical because Josephus is so close to the action. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, but I would offer a different perspective on one question. Is I think you said historians you might expect to mention Jesus. I think this is a mistake.
Okay.
I said before that most writings from the ancient world have disappeared, right? People wrote stuff and it's in the wind. I mean, we don't have it anymore. Most historians have disappeared. We know about a bunch of them because, for example, somebody like Plutarch, who's writing a little bit after Josephus, but he's writing in Greece about Greek affairs, and then he's comparing the lives of great Romans and great Greeks and things like that. He uses a bunch of sources, for example, that don't exist anymore. So we know that there's this thing by Donald Rumsfeld. He once said there are known unknowns and unknown unknowns and things like that. Very clever statement. We know that we don't have a whole bunch of these histories. So if you look at the histories we do have, then you ask yourself, who else would be writing about affairs in Judea in, say, around the year 30? There's nobody else. There's just nobody else who survived. Josephus is the guy. He's the authority for that period. And if he had said nothing about Jesus, that wouldn't be surprising because he says nothing about the vast majority of people. I mean, for example, Josephus mentions in his autobiography that he had to go rescue he didn't have to, but he wanted to rescue some friends of his who got caught up in the war in Jerusalem and were crucified. And Titus, being friendly toward him, said, look, if there's anything I can do for you, just ask, And he said, well, I got some friends hanging on crosses, actually, or people I know. Can we take them down? Titus says, yeah, sure, fine. And he goes off and has them taken down. Now, they died, or a couple of them died after being taken down anyway. But what I'm trying to say is, and even in the Gospels, you have a story about these other chaps, crucified. If you've seen Life of Brian, people are crucified all over the place. We don't know anything about any of these people, right? So what my point is, why on earth would somebody writing with Josephus? I mean, Josephus is not a video recorder. He doesn't have like cameras set up all over Judea recording everything that happened. He's a writer. with
Yeah.
his own interests. And he's only going to write about stuff, even in the war, even in his book on the war, even the major players in the war, even the most important players in the war, he hardly says anything about them.
Hmm.
And he leaves all kinds of vague stuff, like he'll make a comment that nobody knows what it means, or he will introduce a guy and then never mention him again, and tell you he's really, really important, this guy, and then just never say anything more about him. So part of what I want to say to you and your viewers today, Tim, is that much of the discussion about this Testimonium Flavianum is from a perspective of not really understanding, perspective. Like, what is a legitimate perspective to have on all this stuff? So you hear all kinds of claims about, well, why didn't anybody else mention Jesus, for example? Who else would mention him? His followers.
Can I ask this one thing?
And they did,
Well, I guess this is a good clarification question. I guess there's two different ways that I'm thinking about this. One of them is I think more straight up down your line, which is historical. But the other side is more the Christian, for lack of a better term, the Christian propaganda side, which says that Jesus turned the world upside down. He did so much, you couldn't write, all the books in the whole world couldn't contain what he did. Certainly we know there were other messianic, apocalyptic, magician kind of prophets in that place. Plenty of people who were in that general category of people that were trying to get people to anticipate the return of, the angels and God, and the return of Jews to, what the way life should be, and to Torah observation. But Jesus stands out far and wide. He's not, from a Christian perspective, he's not those guys. He's not the little preacher with a few followers. He is the God man. He is the man who did everything. He's the man who's feeding 4,000 here, 5,000 here. He's turning the temple, he's taking the marketplace, and he's, upsetting it all, whipping people. He's the kind of guy that, if the Christian story is accurate to any extent, that you would kind of expect somebody to write about. Is that fair to say?
Well, depends what, if you just think about our society today, you have all kinds of clubs and groups and political parties even that they don't have enough of a constituency to actually get into, like Congress in the US or the Canadian Parliament or the British Parliament, but they are there and they have a charismatic follower. Nobody's heard of them. Except the people in the party, and they think they're the greatest thing since sliced bread, and their leader is, kind of messianic figure in some sense. But very often they don't make any bubble, as it happened with the Christians. It wasn't, for a couple of generations. Pliny the Younger, who's this, he becomes a governor, top-level governor, in terms of what I was talking about before, in what is now Turkey, and he's only heard about the Christians, and that's in around 110 CE, 110 AD. He's heard about Christians in Rome because they're gradually growing, and he knows that they've been on trial and been punished, been killed for being Christians. But that's in 110. So that's, almost a century after, like it's 80 years after the putative time of Jesus' crucifixion. And it's still like a word spreads very slowly, right? And he writes to the emperor saying, I've heard of these people, but I've never been present at one of their trials. That's already interesting, right? So although he's a senator and he's very clued in Rome, he's just saying, I know about them, but I don't know exactly what the deal is with these people. So, I grabbed a few and tortured them to try to extract the truth from them. But I don't know what we're supposed to do with them. That's quite telling, right? So if you think about that, in answer to your question, I think, yeah, sure. Certainly later Christian propaganda, and when the Christians, they did from the 2nd century onward, they just like mushroomed in numbers. And they became a big deal. But if you're thinking about then who would have noticed Jesus himself back in the early part of the first century and written about it? Well, there's nobody. I mean, we don't have any historians of Judea. We just don't have them from the 30s or the 40s or the 50s or the 60s. And we only get Josephus writing in the late part of the first century. So to use that against, say, the existence of Jesus or something doesn't make any sense to me.
Sure.
I mean, this is what we've got, right?
Yeah.
So then the question becomes, come back to our main topic, how much of this paragraph did Josephus write himself? And that's what I'm happy to answer your questions, but I have.
Thank you for that rabbit trail too, by the way. I appreciate your entertaining my question.
I have a little presentation made up.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Take viewers through it. If you'd like me to do that, I can do it.
Yeah, that'd be great. Then thank you for the entertaining my rabbit trail there. I appreciate your. I just had a couple questions there, but this is great. Yeah, dive right into your presentation. I'm eager to see what you got.
Okay, so I'm going to share the screen here, and so you can see that, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so here's the passage. Here's my own translation of it. Very similar to what you read. Let's go through it just to put the phrases in our minds, because what I want to do with your viewers is think for a minute about the general issue of how you decide whether something's an interpolation or not. Interpolation meaning, of course, something the original author didn't write, but it was stuck in by somebody else. So in this case, Christian copyists. So I'd like to take a couple of minutes to talk about the general phenomenon of interpolation by Christians and what one could reasonably expect, and then really drill down. I'm hoping that your viewers will enjoy this, because it's what I'm trying to do is invite you into the kind of work that I do, so people can actually see it.
Yeah,
now,
this looks awesome.
Great. Well, of course, it's in Greek, and most people haven't had the joys of, when you're learning Greek. One of my Greek teachers said something like, it's like cleaning the toilet. Nobody wants to do it. Everybody wants to have it done. So you want to be on the other side of it.
Pardon my bad sense of humor here, but I got to ask, do you ever drop that joke? It's all Greek to me.
Yeah. Well, yes, quite often. It's actually a wonderful language. It's extremely difficult. I mean, in the sense of reaching quite a high level, where you could pretty much read all varieties and all classes without too much trouble. It's pretty challenging.
Yeah, I took about 2 or 3 years of it, but I definitely got my feet wet enough to know what you're saying. It is a very, especially when you start getting to all the different verb tenses, and it is.
Well, fortunately, the New Testament is not so difficult. It's got some difficult bits in it, but it's not so difficult. A writer like Josephus, and I'll mention this now because it's relevant to the passage, in books 17, 18, and 19 of his Antiquities, remember, Greek is a second language for him. He had to struggle to learn it. And he says, quite, because he's so proud of himself and all his achievements, he says at the end of the Antiquities, I really worked at this bloody language, and I still don't pronounce it the right way. People make fun of my pronunciation. I do that. My habitual pronunciation, it's not flawless. But then he says, well, we don't care about that. We Judeans, we care about substance, not appearance. Anyhow, so the point is, in these books of the Antiquities, he's actually, the way you learn in the ancient world is by imitation. And he's practicing his imitation of a very famous Greek historian, Thucydides, who wrote in a very terse, difficult style. And Josephus, in these volumes, is practicing his imitation of Thucydides. This was a very common thing to do. Thucydides is hard enough to read. Josephus, sometimes in his imitation of him, is awful. But this passage is not so bad. This one is actually pretty straightforward. But the reason I say that is I'm going to be showing you how some phrases in this passage fit only really in Antiquity 17 to 19. So this is why I mentioned to bear it in mind. So now about this time comes Jesus, a wise man. If indeed one should call him a man, he was a doer of remarkable deeds, teacher of persons who welcomed the true things. And this is a very literal wooden translation for reasons I'll show you. With pleasure. People who welcome the true things with pleasure. And he won over both many Judeans and also many of the Greek element. He was the Christ. That's what text says. On his indictment by the principal men among us, and having been condemned to the cross by Pilate, this governor, those who loved him in the first place did not yield. He appeared to them after the third day, or having third day, living again. These and countless other amazing things having been spoken about him by the divine prophets, even to now still. And so this is a very literal translation for reasons I'll explain. Even to now still, the breed of the Christians, named from this fellow, did not expire, even to now still. So he's writing this in the year 93, 94. We can date it quite precisely because he gives a triple dating of it at the end. So it comes out in the reign of Domitian in Rome, 93, 94. So he's saying, even till now, well, this was way back in the time of Pontius Pilate's governorship, but even these decades later, 5, 6 decades later, they're still around, these people. So that's what amazes him, this breed of the so-called Christianoi, Christians, named after this guy because he's known as Christ. Right? So it's important to bear in mind how the structure of the passage is. Right? That's the passage.
So this is the Testimonium Flavianum. This is it.
Yeah, this is the Testimonium Flavianum. Now I wonder if I actually play this, can you still? Yeah. It still work, right? Okay. Right. So I'd like to briefly go through various considerations we need to keep in mind when we think about whether Josephus wrote this, right? First of all, we need to talk a little bit about interpolations in general in the New Testament Jewish text and the works of Philo of Alexandria, Josephus, and others. Then look at the Greek manuscripts of Josephus. Then ask the question, did copyists usually insert stuff elsewhere? Because remember, he wrote 30 volumes. Then look at the Christian writers who quote Josephus. That's another interesting question because the issue is, do they know, if they're Christians, surely this would have been interesting to them to know that Josephus wrote this. And then what's the context? And then the language of the passage. So very, very quickly, some general observations here.
Yeah, this is awesome.
So first point is, yes, in some ancient texts, especially Christian ones, copyists very frequently would make their own little comments in the margins when they're copying. And then the comments would be sucked in the next round of copying because the person would think, oh, that was a correction or something like that. And they'd weave it into the text. This happened like very frequently with Christian texts, especially because these are part of their own community. Now, there are nearly 6,000 Greek manuscripts of the New Testament. So this is very important. We have tons of manuscripts, and many of them quite early, of the Greek New Testament. And they have countless variants, usually very small ones, but sometimes whole paragraphs interpolated. So that's the New Testament, right? So that's one like sacred text of the Christians, and it's heavily, heavily copied and copied and copied and worked over and corrected, right? So somebody's copying it and says, that doesn't sound right. I think it must have meant this. And then what he put in as a correction gets sucked into the text. That's one set of texts. Christians somehow, for whatever reason, they feel free to correct their own texts.
Is it, can I interject, is it fair to say that some of those may have been either a striving to make sure that if there's two choices for this theology or for this point, to make sure that it goes down this path, not this one, and also
Well, yeah.
to correct anyone that might say, well, you have some kind of error here, and like to correct it, where, like, for example, after Judas hung himself and Jesus appears to the 12, some of them would later correct it and say, no, it was only 11. Judas wasn't part of that, so they can't be the 12 anymore. It has to be the 11. Like, to correct what might be errors. Is that?
Yeah. Or so, like when Mark, gives, he says that this is written in the prophet, and he gives one prophet's name, and that's a mistake. And then some of the copyists will say, no, this was actually this prophet here.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly like that. And so, for example, you have two versions of the Lord's Prayer, one in Matthew, one in Luke. And in many of the manuscripts, you can see a tendency to assimilate them, one to the other, right? Because they know the version in Matthew, and they're saying that's not right in Luke, so they correct them. So I think that's a big part of the reason why the Christian texts, particularly the New Testament texts, are heavily corrected, and there's tons of variants in them. And some of them are more substantive. I'll show you a couple of examples. Then there's a whole question of Jewish texts that we call pseudepigrapha. It's a really ugly name, really, especially the pig part in the middle, but it doesn't have anything to do with pigs. It's pseudepigrapha, so falsely attributed. So an epigraph is a writing upon an attribution of a text, and a pseudepigrapha are falsely attributed. That means that they claim to be by people they're not by, like the Testament of Moses. Moses didn't write it, or third Baruch, Baruch didn't write it. Things like that.
And we have some of that in the New Testament canon, most likely as well, right?
Possibly. Well, in the letters of Paul, yeah, definitely there are pseudo-Pauline letters. That's right. Yeah.
And I've heard, is it Second Peter might be one of those as well?
Yeah, as well. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Then there's a question about James. There's a question about a couple of them. Although strangely, scholarship on James is moving around to the idea that he might actually have written the thing, the brother of Jesus, which is quite fascinating. But used to be dismissed out of hand. He couldn't have written it because it's in Greek, in decent Greek. Anyhow, to come back to this, so you have all these other texts that are generally considered to have been Jewish texts, but in at least their current formulation, they look pretty Christian. So in this case as well, and these are texts like the Sibylline Oracles, various apocalypses, testaments of the 12 patriarchs, third Baruch. There's a great deal of variety in these texts. If you ask scholars, I mean, some of them look very Christian, and so Christian that they may not even have any Jewish content in them at all, may not have been based on a Jewish text. Others look like Jewish texts that have been fiddled with Christian stuff, spliced in. And then a bunch of middling texts. It's really hard to say. We can't spend a lot of time talking about these, but I simply mention them because they're a clear example of the kind of thing where texts getting reused by Christians become more and more, and like super Christian, even in some cases. But these are very different from a bunch of other big texts by Jewish authors. So the ones by Philo of Alexandria are about as extensive as the 30 volumes of Josephus. Philo wrote more than 30 volumes, but many of his texts are smaller. So I don't know, I don't remember the exact number of his texts. Many of them are just essay length. But if you put them on a shelf together, they're roughly the same, same size. So the whole corpus, we call it, corpus, the body of work of Philo, Josephus, the Maccabean texts like First and Second Maccabees and Fourth Maccabees especially, the Wisdom of Ben Sirach, Tobit, Judith, these texts that are in the so-called Apocrypha of the Bible. There's really no evidence, even though they were preserved by Christians. There's little to no evidence of Christian tampering with them. Why not? Why? So you've got a spectrum here of the Christians' own texts, which are heavily interpolated, heavily changed in copying. You've got these other middle texts that vary considerably. And then you've got this big collection of quite important texts that show little or no Christian tampering. And why is that important? Well, because it must have been very tempting, actually, with these texts. In the case of Philo, nobody ever talks about Philo in this regard. So with Josephus, there are these 3 or 4 paragraphs that, especially the mythicist group, if you don't mind my saying so, Tim, like to focus on and say, I think that's interpolated. Well, it's convenient for them, but they're forgetting about the whole big picture. There's a huge amount of stuff that should have been very tempting for Christians to mess around with. In Philo has this whole teaching about the Logos as a kind of divine being, kind of a manifestation of God. My goodness, it's like if anything should have lent itself to Christian manipulation, stick Christ in there somewhere, that would have been it. But they preserve this stuff, and apparently there's absolutely no reason to think that Christians actually messed around with it. In the case of Josephus, the first 11 volumes of his Antiquities are a complete paraphrase of the Bible from Genesis to, past the exile. Now, we know what Christians did with this stuff. You have things like the Epistle of Barnabas, which is a complete reworking of the Bible to show Christ, to say, like, every time there's anything that could be interpreted like the shape of a cross, like a T, a tau in Greek, Jesus, this was prefiguring Christ. That's how Christians roll, that's how they just saw Christ in everything. But Josephus' entire biblical paraphrase shows not even a whit of Christian tampering. And nobody's ever argued that he did, that there was such tampering. Why? Well, my own suspicion, I can't prove this, my suspicion is that certain kinds of texts lent themselves to Christian tampering, especially the kind of apocalypses, the testaments, the more, I would say, weird texts from a modern point of view, kind of eerie, the ones that involve angels and revelations and things like that. People could kind of stick Christ in there and it wouldn't really look that much different to what's already there. It's sort of odd, Whereas when you're dealing with an author such as Philo, even people whose Greek is not that good, they look at his and say, wow, this guy really knows what he's doing here. He's a very smart character. And if you just go sticking in like Christ in the middle of that, it's going to stick out like a sore thumb. For the Christians, it had some benefit just to copy this stuff and read it and say to themselves, oh, that's comforting to us. He's talking about the Logos without having to actually change it. There's something very similar that happens with Josephus. Josephus is used as a witness to Christian truth. So when you see Eusebius writing in the 4th century, he makes a big deal, so does Origen before him, of Josephus as a non-believer. It's very important for them that he's not a Christian, right? Because what he says then can be used with kind of purity to say, like, if we want to say Jerusalem was destroyed because of God's punishment of the Jews for killing Christ. So what Eusebius says is, okay, the Jews really, really, really suffered for having killed Christ. Don't believe me? Go and read Josephus's Jewish War. Man, that work talks about their suffering in massive detail, and he quotes from it, where Josephus talks about cannibalism and starvation in the city. Now, Eusebius, he doesn't use quotation marks, but he makes clear where he's ending the quotation. And then he says, and that was because they killed Christ. What he doesn't do is stick the Christ bit into the quotation.
Hmm.
So this is very important that Christians, they're not entirely stupid, especially the more learned ones like Eusebius. They knew that if you contaminate the evidence, it's not going to work for you. You let these people be what they are, and then you add in what you want to say. Now, there's a later Christian writer in the 4th century. We call him Pseudo-Hegesippus. His parents did not call him Pseudo-Hegesippus. We don't know his real name. But
what does Hegesippus mean? Do you know?
Well, it's a version of Josephus. It's like,
okay,
if think of the consonants, Josephus. It's like Josephus. It's Josephus, but that's the problem. It's a mashup of Josephus with another guy named Hegesippus, who was a Christian author, and so the text was known to be a rib of Josephus's work. But anyway, the reason I mention him is he took a different view. He couldn't stand reading Josephus because he said, the guy's a Jew. Why are we using him to prove our truth? He's not a believer. He shared in the Jewish perfidy, the Jewish betrayal and treachery. So what we need to do is take his facts and put them in a proper Christian setting. So that whereas Eusebius said, you want to know how bad the Jews suffered, go read Josephus. And I'm telling you, this was because they killed Christ. The writer of Pseudo-Hegesippus says, I just got to tell you the truth, man. And he rewrites Josephus's story, but he actually inserts Christian stuff into the story. Right? So he loses Eusebius's, rhetorical device of being able to say, that's what Josephus said, I'm going to interpret that for you. Pseudo-Hegesippus just collapses it all into one. And he says, this is what happened. The Jews killed Christ and they suffered. And Titus, the emperor, already recognized this. Everybody knew that, this starvation and stuff was because they killed Christ. But he just goes right in. He goes for it, just puts it right in the story. This is what I'm trying to say, is that there was generally a respect among Christians for whatever motives. The motives were to prove their own truthfulness, but still the way they thought they should do that is let people be who they were. So very quickly, here's Welcome to My World. Here is a Greek text of the passage of the woman caught in adultery in the New Testament. Here's a case of a clear Christian. Well, it's an interpolation in this passage. It's if your viewers still have New Testaments, they'll find this in John chapter 8, end of John chapter 7, John chapter 8, and it's a very moving story. The one about Jesus teaching in the temple, and the Pharisees and scribes say to him, look, this woman was caught. How anybody caught her exactly in the act of adultery is not specified, but anyway, shouldn't we stone her? And Jesus says, let the person who is without sin cast the first stone. It's a very humane and moving story. And so here, what I'm trying to show you is that if you have the text up here, that's how these textual editions work. And then you have this mass of weird looking symbols down in the bottom. And it says here 753 to 811. And then what it does is it tells you the the manuscripts that include 753 to 811 here are all these ones. There's a whole bunch of them, numbered texts, and then names of all these texts that include it here. And you think, oh, that looks impressive. Well, except that some include the passage in a completely different place after John 21. And there's another one that includes it in Luke in this place, and then other ones included in Luke over there. And actually, the text looks more Lucan. If you study the vocabulary and the themes of it, it looks like it fits better in Luke, so it would be displaced from Luke. But not only that, then if you keep looking, you see omits. And these turn out to be the very best manuscripts, the earliest ones, P66, P75, Vaticanus, and Alexandrinus, and the very best earliest texts don't have it at all. They just flat out don't have the passage. And this goes on for a couple of lines, right? All these numbered texts just don't have it.
And when you say the very best, meaning usually the earliest?
The ones scholars have come to think of as the kind of most sensible text, that is to say earliest, and they're free of a lot of later developments, a lot of later interpolations, yeah. And they just flat out don't have it. So you'll find in a modern New Testament that it will be bracketed, and there will be some comments in the bottom of the translation saying this isn't found in the best manuscripts. The same thing happens with Mark chapter 16. The best manuscripts end it very abruptly at verse 8. But especially if you grew up in a Pentecostal church, you'll be familiar with Mark 16, 9 to 20, because that's where Jesus says, the risen Jesus says, resurrected Jesus says, if you don't worry, I'm going to give you a lot of power, and if you drink any deadly thing, if you eat any deadly thing, it won't harm you. You can pick up snakes, and the poisonous snakes, and they won't hurt you. So, in the southern states, you'll know better than I do, I guess. There are these snake handlers, who actually press the point and hold poisonous snake just to show that Christ will protect them. It doesn't always work out so well.
No, it doesn't.
But anyway, that's all based on passage that isn't actually in Mark, according to the best manuscript. So those are some famous passages that you see. What I was trying to illustrate there was with Christian texts, and you could see, the apparatus here, every single page, and they're only showing you the most important variations here. There are, nearly 6,000 Greek manuscripts of the New Testament. They just show tons of small changes. Now, if you look at Josephus's manuscripts, it's a different story. Where you have numerous manuscripts, you're going to have disagreements. That's in the nature of the case. But in the case of Josephus' Antiquities, there are only 6 main manuscripts. So this is a completely different world. But they're from a much later time. But all of them have the Jesus passage with tiny verbal differences. But they date from the 10th century. So that's lots of time for changes. So here's a look at the very passage that I translated before in a Greek text. So you have the main text, and it begins on one page and runs over to the next one. And then you have the manuscript variants below. And the ones below that red line here are the ones that are relevant. Sorry, I have a very sensitive trackpad, it seems, on my computer. So these ones here relate to that passage there. And what you see here, or what I see here, is that they're very minor things. So for example, this one here, it says received with pleasure, right? This is implied in the Greek dative, with pleasure, but here one of the manuscripts sticks in a preposition with as well, like an explicit preposition, received with pleasure. It doesn't change the meaning, right? That's the same thing with the others. So whereas it says around this time, yes, ton chronon, right? So down here, there's another word used for, or is it this or that? Around that time or this time. These are the differences in the manuscripts, but nothing significant. There's the rest of the passage and then the rest of the apparatus. what it shows you is that all the manuscripts have the passage. They have minor differences of language.
Hmm.
So here's the thing. Josephus was quickly recognized after he wrote as being what he wanted to present himself as, the man. People recognized around in the classical world, oh, this guy's the expert on Judea. So writers like, in my view, Tacitus already borrows from Josephus. Not everybody agrees, but certainly Herodian in the 2nd century borrows from him as the expert. He cites him many times by name. And then at least half a dozen, maybe 10 other Christian writers use Josephus in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. We're not sure because only some name him. Others look like they're using him, like Melito of Sardis talks about cannibalism, or it seems to be talking about cannibalism in the time of the war. That would come from Josephus, even though he doesn't mention him by name. So it seems that maybe 10 authors are using him. None of them mentions the passage on Jesus. Now, you might think immediately, oh, okay, why wouldn't they do that? Well, Origen, writing in the mid-3rd century, knew very well the antiquities and still says Josephus did not believe in Jesus as Messiah, as Christ. Does this mean that the whole passage on Jesus was not there in their copies? Some people say, and it sounds superficially compelling, they say, well, come on, why wouldn't Christian authors mention Josephus if they knew him to have mentioned Jesus? Well, it's a little bit more complicated. Before Origen, Christian authors don't mention anything from the antiquities at all. They mainly use his Appian, against Appian, which is the shortest of his works, apart from the autobiography, which is no use to anybody. It's this little essay, and it's a very vigorously argued essay on the antiquity of the Jews. This was gold to the Christians because they wanted to argue that they were not a new group. They were just continuous with the Jews. And so they modeled, like Clement of Alexandria, modeled their arguments on the Appian, and they borrowed from the Appian. So that was their favorite text. And then they began to use the war a little bit fleetingly, but they never borrow anything at all from the antiquities. Could be because remember, we have computers, right? And we have books. We can just flip the pages and go to Antiquities 18. They didn't have that. They had like a 20-volume work was 20 scrolls, right? Which you have to unroll with no word divisions, no dividers between the words to save space. Like it's a total mess. So it's entirely possible that most of them had not even cracked open the antiquities because they didn't seem to know about it. The war, they knew about at least, and they knew basically what it was about. Eusebius is a scholar, and Origen was a scholar, and they really start to dig into these texts. They didn't use any later material before Origen, we're talking about, didn't use any later material from the antiquities on Pilate, the high priest, James, the brother of Jesus, John the Baptist, nothing. So presumably, all of this, as well as the Bible paraphrase, would have been of great interest. Those passages are all near the end of the 20-volume antiquities. So it's not the case. What I'm trying to say is that we have our intuitive response, but we need to always think a little bit more methodically and get a bigger perspective on what's going on. Because what I want to show you in a minute is that even after the Jesus passage was well known from Eusebius, Christians still didn't use it. So if you have the assumption that because it's there, they would have said, aha, he said Jesus was the Christ. Well, it's not true. Even Eusebius, who is the first guy to mention the passage with all that is in it, doesn't use it that way. He doesn't use the statement, he was the Christ. He's not interested in it.
Is there any,
we have to check our assumptions about what they would do. Sorry, Tim. Go ahead.
how much weight is there to the idea that some of them may not have had the antiquities, just it wouldn't potentially be in every library? Is that of much value, or do you think there was enough interconnectedness that they would have heard about it? And
yeah, I think it's entirely, I mean, we don't know. And it's entirely possible that they knew only the War and the Appian, which were more portable texts, and those are the ones they were interested in. The antiquity is, I mean, I have to tell you, I've read it many times, and it's like pretty daunting. It's pretty boring. I mean, most times, you know, people buy Josephus's works, but they mostly use them to open the door, or, you know, use them as a paperweight on the desk or something like that. Because actually reading, especially the antiquities, the biblical paraphrase can be quite interesting, but even then, most people rather read the Bible than Josephus's version. So, and all the stuff from Antiquities 12 to the end, it's usually even scholars who are supposed to be paid to do this stuff. You know, they famously said it's just a big patchwork of like a miscellanea. You know, it's not really interesting to read, and hardly anybody, even scholars, have actually read it. So I think we shouldn't be too hard on early Christians for not having plowed through all this stuff.
Can I ask about that patchwork concept you mentioned? Yeah. I've heard it mentioned that the testimonium is in a context where, and if you're going to cover this later, feel free to just postpone this question, but where it doesn't make too much sense because he's talking about other things. In other words, it isn't like he's talking about where there was this prophetic preacher, and there was this one, there's this one, there's this one. Oh, and there's also another one named Jesus. It isn't like that. It isn't like a context where it makes sense. And people have said, well, it's all this, if I'm remembering correctly what I've heard, it's a lot of stuff about the bad stuff Pilate did, where, you know, he's slaughtered these people, he massacred these people, he did this and that. And it's like right in the middle. Oh, and by the way, there's a man named Jesus. And now back to what Pilate's doing to kill everybody and, you know, put everybody in prison. Like, is that correct to say that it doesn't look like it doesn't fit first? And then how does that relate to just what Josephus tends to do?
Yeah, I think mainly this comes from people who don't have to work with Josephus every day.
And I'll admit, I'm not up to into the deep end of this yet, so I'm definitely just trying to feel my way out as to what questions make sense.
It's a perfectly good question, and I'm happy you asked it because I can respond to it. First of all, the obvious reason it's there is because Pilate's involved. He's the guy who executes Jesus. So that's the connection. There's not a great connection between the next story is the business in Rome that happened in 19 CE about the expulsion of Jews and Egyptians from Rome. This got nothing to do with Pilate at all, except that chronologically, if Pilate's term. So the way he connects it is by saying, at about this time, katatuton ton chairon or tatatuton ton chronon, at about this time, this happened. And so, you know, any writer of history, I read a lot of history, and you see it just all the time. If somebody's trying to write year by year, they have a devil of a time. Like, you have to choose as a writer. Are you going to follow certain stories through from the beginning, like everything connected in a narrative, and then jump back to the next story and confuse your readers that way? Or are you going to confuse them by doing everything that happened horizontally at the same time? So this happened, and about the same time this was going on, about the same time that was happening over here. That's also confusing, but it's clear that's the method he chose. In the Antiquities, he does a bit of jumping around back and forth, but he tries. You know, he says his excuses around this time. This is what happened. In the case of the Jesus episode, if people are going to get all sensitive about that, not really fitting, I think it fits as well as pretty much anything in Josephus. I mean, right now I'm translating and writing a commentary on Book 4 of the War. And there are all kinds of things in there. Like, Josephus has the habit of diverting here and there and everywhere. It's what you might call an ABA pattern to dignify it a little bit. He's doing A, he goes to B, and he comes back to A. And that's a rhetorical device, is to keep everything lively, like rather than just telling one, big old story. Everybody's kind of,
Yeah.
he says, "Oh, I'm back over in Rome at this time," and he's got a Roman audience, right? And you could expect him to say, "Oh, yeah, Rome. Yeah. This is the expulsion of those Egyptians. I remember hearing about that. Yeah, under Tiberius. That was at this time as well." So, he varies the tone of things, and yes, there's a variation in tone, but it's not like Pilate has been massacring people. Those two other episodes I mentioned, the aqueduct and the standards brought in, they're actually quite compelling human interest stories. And he says they broke out into disturbance, and then Pilate calmed them. And in fact, the verb pauomai, pause or stopped, pauomai, has been used in the preceding episode. So Pilate used pauomai, that is, it's a Greek verb meaning he stopped. He brought it into. It's the same verb that's used in the Jesus story in reverse. His followers did not pauestai. They did not stop believing in him. So this is one of the devices Josephus also uses, stringing together passages with the same words that are recalled.
That's
so
interesting.
If you're asking me my opinion, I don't see a problem with it that way. There is a change in tone. Now you're dealing with this wise man, which is not what was going on before. But Pilate's still involved, and it's still more integrated than the next story, which is about events in Rome. That's my view.
Great, thank you for answering that.
So Eusebius is the most interesting figure here, because he's the first guy to actually quote the paragraph on Jesus. But he quotes it 3 times, but he does it a little bit differently in each case. And he improves it. Because there are a couple of oddities in the Greek, which I'll mention in a minute. And he actually changes them to what he thinks is better Greek. So that is a difficult fact for the notion that Eusebius actually invented the passage, which is a view held by some very bright scholars. But I think it's a problem. Anyhow, and also, what I just said before, that he doesn't use the passage saying he was the Christ, which is amazing, right? You'd expect him to say, look, Josephus said he was the Christ. Remember that Eusebius doesn't want that. He doesn't think that Josephus was a believer. And that's important to him to be able to use Josephus. So he actually quotes the passage, right? But his view of Josephus is as somebody who, whatever he meant by this thing, he didn't believe that to be the case. He must have meant that's what his followers thought or something like that. Because Eusebius makes no use of it. Why does he mention the passage? In his famous church history, he cites the passage on Jesus to prove the date of Jesus' death around 30, because there was a text in circulation, another fake text called the Acts of Pilate, which was a Christian production, claiming to be written by Pontius Pilate, his actual, kind of memoirs, giving a different date for Jesus' death. And so he's using this to say, no, it happened here. And let me quote it from Josephus. And Josephus is a trustworthy Jewish author. So Eusebius makes a big deal about Josephus. He says he was the most famous of the Hebrews. He was the most eminent. In fact, there was a statue of him in Rome, Eusebius claims. Could be right. In the library, his works were deposited in the library. He's a very famous guy. And I'm going to use him to prove some things I'm saying about Christ. But no, Josephus didn't believe in Christ. So in the other works, he's countering criticism of Jesus' insignificance, right? Because Greco-Roman authors are looking at Christianity, people like Celsus and Porphyry and later Julian will look and say, this guy's a nobody. Like who is he? Especially Celsus says this Jesus was a nobody. And Eusebius is countering this by saying, hey, man, this guy Josephus, he mentioned Jesus, so he's not a nobody, and claims many converts. But he still doesn't use the passage, the sentence, he was the Christ. So this should help us to adjust our expectations. Right? We just assume that a Christian would do this. And actually, they don't. Christians did not exploit the Christ clause, even when it was there in their texts. So, did Eusebius forge the Testimonium Flavianum? It's definitely possible that because Eusebius was also copied by Christian authors, and he's quoting a great deal from Josephus, there is some cross-fertilization going on there. And some of Eusebius's language may well have influenced the text in Josephus, the same copyists being involved in both of them. This has to be investigated in each case, but it's entirely possible. And I think 2 or 3 phrases in the Testimonium Flavianum probably are influenced by Eusebius. I'll mention what they are. It's, however, unlikely that he created the thing out of nothing, because he's dependent, the whole way that he's using it is to say, look, this guy Josephus wrote, and that fits with his other use of Josephus. It doesn't quite ring true that he would have just created this passage out of nothing and then had the kind of the cojones to say, oh, look, Josephus wrote about this, especially because it doesn't really fit his language in most cases and his method, and he will improve the language a bit. So he only cites other bits of the passage for his purposes, and that's quite interesting. And after Eusebius, Christian writers who know his work still insist that Josephus did not believe in Jesus and use other parts of the testimonium, but they don't take that passage. So here's that guy I was talking about, Pseudo-Hegesippus, we call him. He has a version, and he's writing like 40, 50 years later than Eusebius. He writes in Latin. And there's his version of the passage. So he knows about the Eusebius passage, but he doesn't have Josephus say he was the Christ. He says, if it's proper, however, Josephus said, to call him a man. He just drops out that bit altogether. He doesn't even have the Messiah claim. And remember, his whole thing in his introduction is that Josephus was a Jew who didn't believe in Christ. So that's really interesting, right? Here's a Christian who knows about the line, but he just flat out drops it out. Jerome, later, still in the 4th century, around the same time, a little bit later, knows both Josephus and Eusebius. He praises Josephus' writing in general, knowing that he's an unbeliever. He translates the passage almost verbatim from what we have in the Greek. But he says, Josephus, wrote about the Lord in this manner. At this time was Jesus, a wise man, if indeed it's proper to call him a man. He was a worker of remarkable deeds. And then he says, in Latin, et credebatur esse Christus. He was believed to be Christ. So Jerome, who's like super Christian guy, I mean, he's really a half crazy kind of Christian sainty guy. All he thinks that Josephus said is he was believed to be the Messiah or the Christ, which would fit with Josephus's text.
What you'd expect. Yeah.
That's the kind of thing you'd expect of him. And then even later Christian authors still are quite uncertain about the whole thing. Christian writers continue to assume that Josephus was not a believer. So Theodoret, Isidorus say that. Isidorus praises Josephus for being fair enough to acknowledge that Jesus taught the truth, given that he's an unbeliever. That's it's very square of him to admit that Jesus taught the truth, but he still doesn't make anything of the Christ laws. And then much later in the 10th to 12th centuries, you have Arabic and Syriac Christian writers still qualifying the belief, notice, saying he believed that they believed that he was Christ, not that he was Christ. Now, there is some later Christian exploitation of this. So Gregory of Nyssa in the 4th century not only quotes that line from Eusebius, he was the Christ, but has Josephus say, also, he just starts adding in new Christian stuff into this story, like Pseudo-Hegesippus, right? He just starts adding in Christian stuff. So he goes and says, and he has Josephus say the Jews nailed Jesus to the cross. Now that is clearly a Christian, perspective. The Jews killed Christ. So what I'm saying is, once Christians really do start drilling into this stuff, then it's open season, and they just start sticking other stuff in. But it's clearly then an interpolation when they do that. So some Christians could and did alter Josephus, but it's pretty clear when they did. So how do we summarize this? If this was the Christ is in Josephus, if he wrote it, then it's hard to explain the ongoing impression that he was not at all a believer. Why didn't anybody think he was? Second, the later, even much later statements he was believed to be, and the lack of exploitation of this by Christians. Then again, if Christians created the entire passage, we'd expect it to be a more Christian version of Jesus' life, not of such a kind of hesitant, mitigated version. So an economic hypothesis is that Josephus wrote something about Jesus and his followers, but not this statement, he was the Christ. And that's what most, I think, sensible scholars think. But there's more to be said. We can't be sure of the details. Well, skip over this stuff. That's enough. Now, the context in Josephus. Yes, come back to your point. Josephus has called these two previous episodes outrages that occurred. And this is not an outrage. Also, the expulsion of Judeans from Rome, he says, is a different kind of terror that occurred to Judeans there. But as I said, there is a parallel. Pilate's involved, and it ends with the use of this verb paomai. Josephus says that Jesus' followers did not cease to paomai, to revere Christ. So there are links and connections. And later on, of course, some people say this is an interpolation as well, but there's an incidental reference, a very incidental reference to James, the brother of Jesus. But Josephus introduces it this way, that the serving high priest, Ananus II, convened a council of judges and hauled before it the brother of Jesus, the one called Christos, a man by the name of, and so this guy's name itself is postponed till he first says, well, he's the brother of the Jesus, the one called the Christ. And then he says, and his name was Jacob, or James, as we say in English, and some others. But he's singling him out. It's not just James he's talking about. He's saying there were a whole bunch of guys killed by this Ananus on the charge that they'd broken the law, and they were delivered over to be stoned. But he singles out one guy. Why? Because he can link him with the previous story. He's the brother of that Jesus who was called the Christ. And this guy's name was James. Doesn't really matter. But, he was James. The reason I'm mentioning him is he's the brother of that other chap that I mentioned just 2 volumes earlier.
Hmm.
So I think the simplest explanation of this is that he had mentioned a Jesus who was called the Christ in 18. I can't prove it, of course. We don't prove these things. So now it's time to look at Josephus's language. And here we have a bunch of questions. What about Josephus's style? Greek is an extremely malleable language. And I've said that the Greek of the New Testament is very simple in many cases. Mark and John, for example, make a lot of very simple sentence structures. Nothing at all like Plutarch or Thucydides or many sophisticated writers. It's like in English, you read a sophisticated writer and then you read, like a child writing English. It's perfectly correct, but it's just really, really different in level of sophistication.
Hmm.
That's Greek is like that, only much, much more so. So you can pitch different writers' styles, like Mark he just likes to say, and this, and that, and that, and that. John likes to use the present tense, like a man walks into a bar, Jesus goes here, Jesus does that. Greek has all these tense structures and, complicated clause structures that sophisticated writers use. John doesn't do that. John's very repetitive vocabulary, things like that. So each writer has a kind of style. It's not all the same, And so part of the question is, how characteristic is the language of the Antiquities, of Josephus generally, and of Antiquities 17 to 19 or 20? Here's the passage again in Greek with translation. And what I simply want to do now is fly through some of these Greek phrases. I'm going to give the translation. So for each one, I include the Greek in case anybody watching has some Greek, as you do, Tim, and you can make a bit of sense of it. So already here, present tense. This is not everybody's cup of tea in Greek, but Josephus likes to do this sometimes. Now comes. Now, in some of your translations, it won't say this. Translators instinctively switch to the past tense to kind of improve or make it more familiar. So it's not everybody's way of writing, but some people like it. Hippocrates or the Hippocratic school and Aristotle use it, and they use it often. So the people who use it often, but most people don't use it. Characteristic of a few authors, not many. It is in Josephus, 10 times in Antiquities, 7 of them in Antiquities 17 to 20. So this is characteristic of this part of the Antiquities. This phrase that I mentioned before, katouton ton chronon, it's found occasionally, but only occasionally in a few classical authors, 2 to 4 times. Josephus has it 5 times, 4 of them in Antiquities 17 and 18. He alternates it with katouton ton kairon, which is a synonym for time, slightly different shade of meaning. But then he uses that also quite often in Antiquities 18. But he also uses it to introduce, so we're talking about 1863. He uses that 1839 and 1880. So just before this passage and after this passage. So it's right at home in this passage. The phrase wise man, sophos aner. Well, it's not really used very much, occasionally found in Euripides, Plato, Aristotle. Josephus has it a few times. And he always uses it of somebody with unusual powers of some sort. Well, Solomon, he says he taught exorcisms, his version of Solomon, it's not in the Bible, taught exorcisms and he had all these strange powers. Daniel could see the future, he was a prophet, and there's an Egyptian seer, a prophet. And these people are called by this. They all have some kind of strange occult powers. So this is again typical. And some people say, well, a smart forger could have known that this was Josephus' style. But the point is, we know this stuff because we have search engines and we can find it quickly by searching very precisely for it. It's not that common. It's not like all over the place. It's just we know that Josephus, over against other authors, occasionally use these phrases. It's not the kind of thing that a forger could easily tell.
Hmm.
This phrase "ege," if indeed one can call him a man, one should call him a man. "Ege," if indeed. It's really not everybody's cup of tea. Some people don't like it. It's again typical of Aristotle and Plutarch. Most Christian writers who quote this passage, including Eusebius, change it. They don't like it either. But Josephus has it 4 times, and all 3 of those in Antiquities are in books 17 to 20. So again, it fits with the style of this experimental part of Antiquities. Phrase, he was a doer of remarkable deeds, poietes, of remarkable deeds. It's rare in authors before Josephus, quite rare, but he has it 3 other times. Remarkable deeds, I'm talking about this phrase, so the paradoxon ergon, remarkable, strange, unexpected deeds. He has it 3 other times in Antiquities, so it's relatively characteristic of him more than other authors. This thing of a doer, he has this poietes 9 other times in the Antiquities and Appian, but usually it means a poet. So it is the word from which we get English poet, poietes, poet, not just a general doer of deeds. But Josephus can use the same word in different senses. That's also part of it. What's interesting about this phrase is that Eusebius has it at least 8 times, and 6 of them don't involve Josephus. And he uses it with as a doer, not as a poet. So here's a case where I think this could be a Eusebian phrase because it's most characteristic of him to use this language this way. Either Eusebius learned it from Josephus in this passage and then thought, I like that, used it several other times, or I think more likely, it's actually been influenced by the copyists copying Eusebius's. That is to say, Eusebius had it in his version. He changed whatever was in Josephus to his version, and then the copyists assimilated this into the text of Josephus. That's my suggestion, because it fits better in Eusebius. But the phrase "remarkable deeds" is quite at home in Josephus. So he may have had something else there. We don't know.
Yeah,
this phrase, "received with pleasure," those who received with pleasure, it's not found in literature before Josephus or afterwards, except with that preposition stuck in soon, afterwards, but not before Josephus at all. And Eusebius changes it to those not who receive it with pleasure, because it's a kind of odd phrase. It's a kind of ironic phrase in a way. So Eusebius changes it just to a more kind of obvious, those who revere the truth. Why? Because the phrase "receive with pleasure" could have a negative tinge, because it's often used in Josephus. He has 8 occurrences of this phrase, all of them in Antiquity 17 to 19, 2 of them shortly before this passage. So this is actually a distinctive phrase, we can say, of his Antiquity 17 to 19. And it is a kind of convoluted way of saying you like something, or you admire or revere something, which is why Eusebius changed it. Also, because he normally uses it with a negative tinge. That is, welcoming someone's death. They receive news of his death with pleasure, or they welcome these false claims or empty promises with pleasure. And this is really interesting, right? Because it raises the possibility that Josephus was much more guarded about Jesus than the passage as it's read in Christian hands. And he wrote something about Jesus, but he wrote something a little bit more skeptical. Here's the wise man. Maybe he's mocking, if you can call him a man, because what they say about him is he was more than a man. And he was beloved by people who receive, nonsense with pleasure, who welcome. So it could well be that there's something like that going on, that Josephus was at least more guarded about Jesus.
Can I ask, is that similar to like how we would maybe make fun of something in English today, where we would say, like we might use air quotes, or be like, he's such a good guy, and we mean,
Exactly.
he's very much not a good guy. Is it kind of like that? Like if you could have used quotes if it was in English, that might have been what he would have done. Like he's
Yeah.
the Messiah, he's the
Well,
Christ.
and indeed, if he had said they believed he was the Messiah, or they believed he was Christ, or they called him Christ, or he was the so-called Christ, or they just stuck this name on him, which is a weird name, as it just means smeared. Like,
Yeah.
they revered this smeared guy, and Josephus doesn't trouble to explain to anybody what that means in terms of biblical, anointing or anything like that. He's not going to bother. He's not going to dignify it with an explanation. So it raises, indeed, the possibility also that he didn't write truth, but wrote something else, or qualified truth in some way, what they believed to be the truth, or something like that, because the true things or true stuff, which is also an interesting phrase. It fits this part of his Antiquities. It's classic because he's not used. There's a normal word in Greek for truth, aletheia. It's now popular as a woman's name, aletheia, right? Because it's just a nice word. It means truth. It's the abstract noun for truth. That's not the word he uses here. Here he takes an adjective and sticks a definite article in front of it and rams them together as one word, making it a plural, the true things. It's a weird way of writing.
Mm.
It's only used by a few authors because it's kind of artistic, So Demosthenes, the orator, Plato in his dialogues, Aristotle, they use it quite a bit because it's this kind of affectation, but it's avoided by most, and no other historians, or most historians, don't use it. But Josephus has 8 other times, 6 of them in the Antiquities 5. So he's one of the few authors who uses it. But it leads to the possibility that because it's an odd expression and because it's unusual, it leads to the possibility that he did something slippery with it that has dropped out of the text.
Hmm.
Also, a curious phrase is what comes next. He doesn't say many Jews and also many Greeks, although that's how translators often render it, because in English, that sounds more balanced. Many Jews and also many Greeks. That's not what he says. He says many Jews or Judeans and also many of the Greek element. So you can see, even in, if you don't read Greek, you can see that polus is the same, many. But instead of using a plural for Hellenes, the Greeks, he says of the Greek. And this is, again, typical of this part of the Antiquities, where he's using these strange neuter substantives for what could be said more simply. He's messing around with the language. So it's a mismatched pair, this Judeans over against the Greek element. Now, Eusebius and the copyists generally correct this. That is, they say, that doesn't look right. So they change it to many Jews and many Greeks, which is what you think somebody should write. But it actually fits with Josephus's artful way of writing. And it's a technique that he really likes using, especially in Antiquities 17 to 19. Now, this phrase, the big phrase, this guy was the Christ, or the smeared, plastered one, which is, so his audience would have no trouble understanding the word Christos, but what they think it meant was smeared or plastered. It's hardly found in normal Greek, but people know what it is because it's simply the adjective form of Christein or Christo, which means to smear. By far, the largest use of it is in Christian, well, it's used in the Greek Bible, the Old Testament, for the anointing of prophets and whatnot. And then it's used all over the place in the New Testament because it's the honorific name of Christ. Josephus has it rarely, but he used it in Antiquities to talk about a plastered roof in Solomon's temple. So in other words, this is to prove that his audience would know what it meant. Just simply the roof was plastered. So it doesn't create any problems. It's just, the problem is, why would you call man by this name? Well, it's no problem if you said this was his nickname. Like he says in Antiquities 20, he's the guy who was known as, because people have all kinds of strange nicknames in antiquity, and nobody ever explains how they got them. Like Cicero, his name, Cicero, means chickpea. He's a chickpea. Well, like hummus. Why is he called hummus? Nobody has any idea why, but that's just his name. So you cut people slack if they have a nickname. Like in his autobiography, he says some of his own ancestors were known as the stammerer, or the humpback, or the short guy, or shorty, or blackie, like Niger. Why did they have black beards, or were they actually, did they have dark complexions, or what? We have no idea. It's just the nickname. So if he had said this guy was known as Christos, people would say, okay, fair enough. That's how he's known. But that's only to distinguish him from all the other Jesuses. There are quite a few in the text. It's a common name, Joshua, Yehoshua. So it's the Jesus who's known as the Christ. No problem. But he doesn't explain it. He often mentions nicknames, but will typically add he's known as this or called that. And then people will say, okay, fair enough. And that's how he does it when he later mentions him in Antiquities 20. So it would make much better sense if he had said that.
Can I ask?
It's clear he doesn't believe that Jesus was the Messiah. And in case anybody doubts that, it's perfectly clear, because this is the only place he mentions Jesus. Sorry, Tim.
I just wanted to make sure I understand, because that is definitely new information for me, and this is really cool. So, growing up as a former Christian, you hear just that Christ is the Greek version of the Hebrew Messiah, Mashiach, meaning the anointed one. And in the Old Testament, the picture is that, God picks someone, to authoritatively represent him as to the people. He's the Messiah, he's the Savior. He's the one that's going to bring about the end result of all the people's waiting, all the people's trying to purify themselves. God, the promise that God's going to redeem and fix the story that's, all these blasphemers or blaspheming against the temple. Finally, the Messiah is going to come, and he's going to be the one that's going to destroy the other authorities, and he's going to set things up correctly. And so there's this sense of like, this is the hope that we have, that the Mashiach is coming, the Messiah, and that the Christ is basically the same thing. Now, when you say, clarify that it also means smeared or plastered one, number one, that's the first time I've heard it, so this is really cool to dive into this. But in what sense? It certainly doesn't mean plastered in the way that we would use it in English now. When you go to the bar and get plastered, but plastering a roof is talking about like actual plaster, some kind of concrete covering or sealant. In what sense? Like, what does that mean to you? For them to call him a smeared one or a plastered one?
Well, I'm really glad you asked, because I just got kind of carried away on this. I'm really glad you paused to ask this. What we have to remember is there are churchy words and there are real life words, right, for the same thing. So let me give an example. You know Greek, so soteria. What's it mean in churchy Greek? Means, sorry?
So I was going to say, guess salvation.
Salvation, right? Salvation. And immediately you think, well, okay, being saved spiritually and all of that. It's used all over the place in Greek. It doesn't mean that at all. It just means rescue, preservation. You got through something.
Yeah.
came through. It's got no spiritual meaning particularly. I'm translating the war right now. It's all over the place in the war. They had no hope of soteria, meaning they had no hope of rescue. They were stuffed, they were going to have their throats cut. So it's an example, and there are tons and tons of words like this. The word we translate church, ecclesia, it's not church. It's not in normal Greek. It's not church. Or faith, pistis, doesn't mean faith in a spiritual sense. In common Greek, it just means like trust. Do you trust me? I remember when I was in Greece, the first time traveling in a shop in like a corner store, and I'd been studying Greek. I think I was feeling a little bit proud of my labors in Greek. And I thought, I'd read like in the theological dictionary of the New Testament, this word time. I don't know if you remember it, Tim. It's actually related to your name, I guess. Time.
Honoring or fearing?
Sorry?
I'm thinking just based on what I know of my name, honoring or fearing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So honor, right? Honor. And there are like articles written about the Greek concept of time. And you think, oh man, what a word. It's like this whole Greek concept of virtue and honor and all of that. And I go into this corner shop, and on every little like swizzle stick and little plastic toy is written time, and then the price in euros. So time just means price. Time means honor or value or price. And that brings you right down to earth. And you'd say, oh, wait a minute. And then you think to yourself, well, hang on. Like we eggheads, right? We academics have like inflated everything into this world of the sublime. And actually, it also belongs to the world of the ridiculous, the daily, very everyday kind of stuff. So anyway, coming back to Christos, the fancy word for smearing is anointing, right? So we say, like even in certain kinds of churches, they talk about the anointing, like in the Pentecostal church, anointing with oil. They don't say come get smeared with oil, because that sounds like gross, right? But it's exactly the same thing. Right. When a king in Israel was chosen by God, he was smeared with oil, right? Except we in English call it the anointing. So yeah, it's very interesting.
Just the idea of just putting a whole bunch of stuff on somebody.
Yeah, it's like,
like when you have too much sunscreen and you're kind of plastered.
Yeah, pour some oil over the, it's like, now you've been anointed, you've been smeared, you've been plastered with oil. Go wash it off, But that marks you out. So yes, the anointed one became this whole kind of, big deal, because it meant the anointing in itself. It's not like you grab a bottle of olive oil and anybody can smear themselves with olive oil, but it's the significance of it, right? It's that a prophet does this to you because the prophet is speaking for God, and he's the one who's marking you out, right? Like people who go to Catholic and Episcopal churches get smeared a little bit on Ash Wednesday, get ash, put on them with the sign of the cross. Well, it's a little bit like that. You're marked out, right? Somehow God has marked you up. But the actual smearing is no big deal. So what I'm trying to say is, like, when you're interpreting a text, Josephus is writing in Rome, and he's trying to communicate with his audience. They know nothing about Bible, Messiah, kings of Israel, prophets anointing with oil. They know nothing of that. So when he says this guy was known as the smeared one, or he doesn't say known as in the text we have, but I've been trying to suggest the text would make perfectly good sense. At least people would know what it meant. They know what smearing means. they'd just be a little bit puzzled. Why are you saying he was the smeared one? So it would make a lot more sense if he said he was known as, or he was called. So this is actually Alice Whaley's proposal, and
Can
I
I,
think it's a very nice proposal. It's, if you look at economy of explanation, this is the most economical explanation, because it would also explain why later writers like Jerome and the Arabic and Syriac writers in later traditions, they all said he was known as Christ, because that's what's in their version of Josephus, actually. Whereas that would mean that in Eusebius, he simply dropped it out because he's a big fan of Christ. So he
yeah.
just said he was Christ. Let's not mess around with, he was known as, he just was.
Can I ask a
Yeah,
clarification
yeah.
from Josephus's perspective? And maybe to me, this is, hopefully this is a decent question. To me, it's kind of $1 million question. But if, two parts, would Josephus have associated Christ with Mashiach the way I'm thinking that, the way we're told as Christians, that that's the same thing? Would he have said it, or would he have picked a different word if he wanted to say, if he did want to say, for example, so and so was the Mashiach? But let me say it in Greek now. Would he have said the Christ, or would he have potentially used a different phrase, do you think? But then I guess maybe a follow-up is how offensive would this have been to a Jewish person to write the words, this man was the Christ? Like, would Josephus, as a person that I presumably was, if he was a Torah observant and a good Jew, he is actually expecting an actual real Messiah at some point, unless he lost his faith or something, but he's expecting there is a real Messiah coming. So, like, would it be offensive to him to say, by the way, this guy was the expected one? He's the one that was promised to us. I would just, my first instinct is to say that if he was a Jew that really believed this, he would kind of cringe a little bit and say, I hate to say it this way, but like, or he'd want to immediately clarify, like, he was called the Christ, but in parentheses, but by the way, he wasn't, and the Messiah is still pending. We'll see when he comes, but it's not this guy. Like, what kind of offense or reaction would he have had to this?
Good, really, really good question, because it allows me to say something quite important, I think. Not because I'm saying it, just something that should be well known in scholarship. Although it depends which scholar you listen to. One thing we have to realize is scholars in this field come from many different disciplines. Some are theologians, some are religious studies scholars, some are classicists, some are historians, some are Jewish studies scholars, some are, there's a whole convergence of disciplines. So it's not like studying ancient Egypt, where scholars are going to just be trained in that history. There are many different disciplines here. So I can't speak for all scholars, but what I think should be known is that the idea that every Jew is waiting for the Messiah, or that all Jews know about the coming Messiah, is, I think, a complete mistake. It's a complete, it's a Christian reading of Judaism in the first century, or Jewish Judean life in the first century. Why do I say that? Well, because we have quite extensive Jewish texts that say nothing about Messiah at all. And where you'd think if it mattered to the person, they'd say something about it. Like Philo of Alexandria is a very learned Jewish author, spends a lot of time interpreting Jewish texts with allegorical meanings and all of that. Never says even a little bit, slightest thing about a Messiah coming. Same thing with, even the Qumran texts. You have some idea of an anointed priest coming. So you have there's often talk about the dual messiahs in the Qumran text. You have an anointed priest and an anointed ruler of Israel.
Yeah.
Then there's a question about what you said as part of the package, the king anointed king would come and deliver Israel from his enemies, a son of David. Well, only some people thought that even among the subset of people who thought there was somebody coming, it could be an anointed prophet, it could be an anointed priest, it could be an anointed son of David. There are a couple of biblical passages that gave rise to this idea that the kingdom of David would not end, but there would be a son of David eventually. But the Gospel of Mark, chapter 12, challenges that flatly. Jesus says, why did the scribes say the Messiah should be a son of David? It doesn't make any sense. That's bad interpretation of the Bible.
Mm.
Well, but Matthew's genealogy makes Jesus a son of David. So there's lots of different ideas, and many authors, well, some important authors such as Philo and Josephus have no concept of a coming Messiah at all. So my understanding of Josephus is both of them do talk about the future greatness of Israel, but they talk about it in a much more a kind of statesman-like way. That is, right now, Rome is ruling everything. And before Rome, it was other great powers. And in the future, the Judeans they'll have their day in the sun, you know. But that's it. There's no personal Messiah involved. So to answer your question, finally, I don't actually I think people who don't have to spend a lot of time with Josephus have expectations. Why wouldn't he say this? As a Jew, he must have thought this. I think most of that is pointless, actually. He's a very, very smart guy, clearly was, and wrote a very full account of Judean life and law and culture and custom, which he loves. He thinks it's the greatest constitution ever made. He compares it with the Athenian, with the Roman, implicitly with the Roman, with the Spartan, with different famous constitutions. He thinks this is the best one ever. But it's got nothing to do with expectation of a Messiah or anything like that. So
interesting.
I don't think any of this would be a problem for him, actually.
Gotcha. I'm sorry to interrupt you. I know you were going to make a point about Alice Wheely.
Yeah, so Alice Wheely argues it's really one of the finest books. It's mostly not about Josephus, it's mostly about the next 2,000 years of using this passage. And she's a very acute scholar. And she argues that the kind of most economical way of explaining what was in Josephus from its later usage is that he said something about this, what he was believed to be, was known as the Christ. And then Josephus would simply have reported that. That would make sense. That's what his followers thought. That's how they nicknamed this Jesus guy. Out of all the many Jesuses, this was the Jesus known as the Christ. Simple. And then what happened in the manuscript tradition, some manuscripts kept that. And that would explain why later Christians also thought that's what Josephus said, or just ignored it altogether because it wasn't important to them, because it was mitigated. And yet Eusebius just drops out the qualifying clause or qualifying phrase.
Interesting.
I mean, we don't know. We don't know. Everything is up for grabs. But I think people should be very, very cautious about, especially because they don't really know. They're not experienced with Josephus. They're not experienced with ancient texts. You just read so much stuff where people take a look at it and say, yeah, Josephus didn't write that. Couldn't have written that. He's a Jew. This is all just pretty much nonsense, right? I've already shown you many Josephine phrases. It's very difficult to understand how someone else could have come up with this stuff or why they would have, and why Christians wouldn't have more Christianized it. So, for example, here what I'm my slide is open at here. The text says in Greek, "and he was." this guy was. That's not Christian usage either. Christians say he is. He is the Christ. So that could be it could be a telltale survival of, it could be, I don't know for sure, but it would make sense if it was a telltale survival of he was known as.
Yeah, it's a
Right?
very good
Because
guess.
put it all in the past tense, right? And then the fact that he goes on to say, and this is often neglected, he doesn't call his followers Jesusites. He says they call themselves Christianoi, taking their name from this guy. And that already also shows that he had somehow mentioned the Christ name. Otherwise, that would make no sense. He couldn't have just said he was Jesus. And that's why they called themselves Christianoi. What? No, that doesn't make sense. It only makes sense if he said he was Jesus, known as the Christ, and that's why they called themselves Christians.
Yeah.
Okay, very quickly now, on indictment, this is how I've translated it, by our big shots. This was a legal term from classical Athens that indexi in the dative here. It's hardly found in ancient historians. Polybius has it twice, but it is often used in Greek legal cases, and Josephus has it 2 other times, both in Antiquities, once also in his section with the same legal sense. So it's relatively characteristic of him. The principal men among us. This is a classically Josephine phrase. The first men, the principal guys, parhemin among us, very typical. He often noticed that Eusebius doesn't, he's not a Judean, so it doesn't make as much sense for him to talk about the first men among us. So he just changes it to the leaders, the Judean leaders did this. Well, but this phrase in Josephus is quite common. In other writers, you wouldn't normally add men. It's obvious, just the first ones, the first people among us. But Josephus adds men to this. He often also just says the first ones or the principal guys, but he often explicitly adds men in Antiquities 14 times, 11 of those 14 times concentrated in Antiquities 17, 18, and autobiography. So this is a distinctive feature of his writing, and the among us is another distinctive trait. He likes to say that because he's very conscious that he's writing as a Judean for foreigners. So that's his kind of default way of saying, among us, this is how it's done. So this is all very characteristic of him. Verb condemn has many different uses. Epitemao. It could be like criticizing other writers or censure. Josephus has it 14 times. Half of these are concentrated in 17 to 19, 6 of them in book 18, and all have the narrow legal sense of condemn to punishment. So again, typical of his language. Those who loved him at first. The at first is a particular use, an adverbial use of a clause. I won't get into the Greek, but anyway, it's only used by some authors. Thucydides likes it a lot, and Josephus is imitating Thucydides here. And he has it 49 times, 38 in the Antiquities, and a quarter of them come in 17 to 20. Also, this verb, you will know it very well, Tim, from your Christian background as well. Agape, agapao, very common in Josephus, 75 times in his works, 49 in Antiquities. Now, this phrasing about the third day, this is quite interesting. He uses an unusual Greek expression. He says that having a third day, he was rise from the dead. This is rare, even in the New Testament, but Josephus has it several times in Antiquities. And it implies after 3 days, right? Having 3 days or a third day, that means it's an unusual expression, but literally it should mean you've got those in the bank, right? Day 1, day 2, day 3 have gone by. So it's not, but so Eusebius changes it to on the third day because that is the Christian counting. He was crucified on Friday. He was in a tomb Saturday. He was raised already Sunday morning, early Sunday.
Right.
So it's really only like a little more than 1 day. It's 1.5 days, but it's on the third day in the inclusive ancient way of counting. But Josephus' expression, having the third day, would naturally suggest 3 days completed. Eusebius changes it to the more Christian on the third day. So that's also kind of interesting. The divine prophets, phrase is only found twice before Josephus. Once in Philo, speaking of Moses as a divine prophet. Josephus has it at another passage in Antiquities of the prophet Isaiah. So it's not frequent, but he does have it elsewhere. And after him, it's not used again until Eusebius. Here's an interesting phrase, which is quite cumbersome in Greek, rather awkward. Even to now still. So the Christians, even to now still. It's kind of really emphatic phrase. They're still at it, even to now. So normally you would say even now or still now, but even to now still is like overkill. It's a very awkward, and most Christians who quote Josephus change it. So the normal would be with a different preposition, a mecheri or something like that, until now, or simply still now. Josephus has the still now part, etinun, 22 times, all in antiquity. So that much is characteristic. And to now, es nun, is rare elsewhere, but Josephus has it in Antiquities 18 twice. So we're getting in the ballpark of typical Josephus language, but still, it's odd. It's made up of distinctive language in Antiquities 18, but what's really interesting here is that in all of Greek literature, the entire phrase is found outside of this passage only in Eusebius. But it's not only when he quotes it, because he keeps it, but he also uses it in 2 other places. Now, that's interesting. So either Eusebius learned it from Josephus and thought, I'll use it again, because one of them is not long after he quotes this passage, he uses the phrase again. So it could be that he got it in his head from Josephus and reused it. Or it could be, I don't know how to decide between these two. It could be that it's his usage, because he uses it one other time again, that was affecting the copying, the transmission of the text. The breed of the Christians, Topulon, which is what you use of like bees or birds or something like that. So first of all, as I said, pointing out the link between the name Christians and Jesus only makes sense if he said something about Christ. He uses this word breed 12 other times, but it's not flattering. It's like a swarm of locusts, or he's quite a misogynist, Josephus, and he uses it of the female gender also. But it's definitely not a Christian term. Christians would not use this word of themselves. It's a derogatory term. So, or slightly derogatory term, anyway. So there we are. We've run through those colored passages. What can we conclude?
That's awesome.
About 16 of these phrases share the distinctive features of the Antiquities, and several of them, of the Antiquities 17 to 19 in this passage. Several others are not distinctive, but they do fit. They are typical of Josephus in general. So the probability that someone else wrote the whole passage, I think, is virtually nil, because you'd have to kind of line up all of these. It's just really hard to imagine how someone could have been motivated to do that and to search out such phrases that are not common, but they're common enough. They do appear that they are typical of Josephus. A clever forger might borrow obvious, like the about this time phrase or something like that, but it's not plausible that he could have searched out the others. So just on grounds of language and style, I think we can have some confidence to say that Josephus wrote much of this passage. He wrote something about Jesus here. It's in all the Greek manuscripts. They differ only in the details. Copyists of Philo and Josephus did not freely insert paragraphs into their material. Many of the phrases are distinctive of antiquities or even this passage, and the contextual indicators require reference to Jesus as Christ for the James passage and so on. And it's quoted in different forms where Christians actually improve it. That is, they change the style to make it a little bit more suitable to their time. However, Josephus did not write the passage as it stands. That's also not really sensible. He was the Christ makes no sense on any reckoning. It would make much more sense if he said if he was called or known as. And the passage is about those receiving X with pleasure, and according to the prophets, may have been retouched as well by Christian copying. Now, Eusebius' language, it seems like, at least in one case, maybe in two, maybe in three, it affected, because he also has this passage, it seems like his version somehow affected it. Josephus' descriptions of Jesus as also Baptist and Jesus' brother show that he could be, and here's, I think, an important point. We should not assume that a Jew could not have written anything respectful, because remember, this is way before Christianity becomes famous or even necessarily separate. These are all Jewish guys. Josephus could know John the Baptist as a Jewish guy and respect him without buying into his use in Christianity. Yeah. Same with James. He could be offended that this guy Ananus, who he clearly in Antiquities clearly says is a violent man, he could be offended that he killed a bunch of people for breaking the law without due process, including James, without being in it. There's no hint in that passage that he's a follower of Christ or a fellow traveler with James. So I don't think we should, carve things up too rigidly here.
Yeah.
In general, indeed, he aims at balance and detachment. That's his whole posture as a historian. He keeps boasting about that. I'm writing a balanced portrayal. Even when he describes the death of people even when he describes Gaius Caligula, his horrible emperor, whom he just excoriates in the worst possible terms for being the worst violator of laws, he still says, the guy was pretty good at rhetoric. He had some skills. When he describes Saul, after saying that Saul broke all of God's laws and died in disgrace, having violated the laws, he says, but this guy was a real man. I mean, this was one tough cookie. He was like the emblem of manhood. So he does that. He balances out, even of the people he doesn't like very well or accuses, he balances out. So I think we shouldn't assume that he's all hostile or all. He can be all hostile, especially in the war. It won't give people even an inch if he really doesn't like them. But most often he's very balanced, and especially in Antiquities, his mode is to be very balanced in his portrayals.
Is it fair to say he's usually pretty reliable in the sense of, like you mentioned earlier, the whole he kind of says he was going to the one place as a general with all these soldiers, and then but later he says I was going as a peacekeeper. Is he in general seen and interpreted as someone that was reliable? Like, is there anything where they just caught him in a straight up lie, where they just said, any way you try to twist this, that's just, you just lied to history? Is there anything like that that's ever come up?
Well, it again depends on the scholar you talk to. You're talking to me, so I'll tell you straight up. I think his portraits in his autobiography and in his war are not in any way compatible.
Hmm.
They're contradictory.
Gotcha.
And also, between the war and the antiquities, he retells many of the same stories, but in a quite different way. So he gives different numbers, altogether different numbers. One time it's like 20,000, another time it's 3,000. He gives
Sounds like
different,
the Bible.
yeah, exactly. But this is quite common in ancient historiography. So,
Hmm.
the
Okay, I
problem-
just want to throw that question there. I just want to throw it in because it does kind of, even the word testimonium, he's giving a testimony, so to speak, from a Christian perspective. And it does, if it was a court of law, one of the things that they often throw at people is just how, how reliable is this person? If they've already lied 10 times, now they're going to say, no, this time I'm telling the truth. Well, you might be crying wolf too. And I'm just curious about that. I don't know that changes too much about what you would conclude about Josephus, but it's just interesting to think about if he has a tendency to twist things, exaggerate things, retell stories. It just kind of sets a backdrop of how to perceive, even if we had the originals. And I guess maybe that'd be a hope for some days to someone digs up a first century copy of Josephus. But
here's the most important thing to say about that, I think. It's this, that it's not possible to write a narrative without invention, a lot of invention. I mean, that is, you have to construct the sentences and the paragraphs. So the reason I say that is there's no such thing as just the truth in writing a story of any kind, right? Because the only kinds of things that are objective truth are things like numbers and distances, quantifiables, measurements. And you can get those wrong innocently as well. You say, it's like 30 stadia from here to there. Well, maybe it's 50. You thought it was 30. You're wrong. How many of those are lies? That's the first thing. The second thing is, it's really important to understand about ancient historiography, writing history, that these guys just simply were not concerned in general about fact. What we're obsessed about since the Enlightenment is like factual history. That was not the purpose of writing ancient history. It was a moral enterprise, and it remained that way until the Enlightenment. It remained that way until, well, even through the Enlightenment, it remained that way till the 19th century. That the most important thing about writing history was to express a moral viewpoint, to use examples of lives for moral purposes, to say who was good and who wasn't good. And that's why you wrote history. It was not to say this happened on a Tuesday at 5 o'clock and they were 20 miles from there. It's like that's very rare, that kind of stuff. It's all about moral interpretation. So Josephus does tell very different stories, but whereas we say, well, he's a lying SOB, then I think it's not what's going on with him. He's saying when he wrote the war, he wrote things one way to make war's moral points, which are very powerful moral points. And he lines up the pieces a certain way. When he comes to tell his own life story, he's telling a different story, not contradictory, because it's also a moral story, but it is contradictory in the actual content of the episodes, like how many people were there, how far was this from there, which came first, this or that. He changes it up. And probably doesn't remember. He's writing from memory. It's about his own life. He's writing 30 years later. I think a large number of people today, including me, writing about what happened to me 25 years ago, probably get a lot of it wrong, even though I'm trying to make some valid points about how wonderful I was or whatever, or about my enemies. You're going to get some things wrong. So I want to stress that we just come at this with a different mentality from ancient writers. Yeah. And I don't think it's quite fair for us to hold them to our standards. Because most of the time, they had no way of verifying their information anyway. It's easy for us. We have, Wikipedia and all that stuff. We can easily get our hands on facts, but they really had no way to do that and relied very heavily on their memory, which they didn't care about that much. They were really concerned about the moral import of what they were saying.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. That doesn't rescue Josephus from telling corkers by any means, but I just want to put it in a little bit of a different perspective.
Yeah, that's good. I appreciate that.
Well, that's basically what I wanted to say about the testimonium. I hope that that's been useful. I don't know if you want to have a quick look at the John the Baptist passage or not. It's up to you.
Well, I was going to say we've gone pretty long for this one, but I have got a lot of other questions that I would love to ask. So could I?
Go ahead.
Could I? Well, I was going to. Well, I mean, there's so much that I probably should save them for another episode. Could I ask for a bookmark at a future date to maybe go into the rest of the presentation and to add in my questions?
Yeah,
because
sure.
I would love to dive into some of this more. It feels like we've dove into a lot already, but there are some other clarifications, and also it might be interesting if the rest of it is not too long, and if there's kind of some time for some questions, that I might ask some of my viewers for some feedback based on what we talked about so far, and then kind of add those questions in if there's plenty of time in that one. But this is great. And one question I wanted to just throw in real quick is I threw in a curveball on the end of our last interview, the very last minute, and I just wanted to throw one more in. Just a real quick question: are there parallels between Josephus's shipwreck and Paul's shipwreck? And is there any chance that they're influencing each other? Or even just Josephus and Paul's lives at all? Have you ever heard that or studied that at all?
Yeah, I have. Yeah, of course. I hear all kinds of things in this area. There are so many people who have a stake in this area of ancient Judaism, Christian origins, and all of that. And there's some really inventive theories out there. So, for example, the group of people who think that the Flavian regime, Vespasian and Titus, created Christianity as a way to replace a troublesome Judaism, and therefore wrote the New Testament. I mean, part of what they'll do is look at parallels between Josephus and the New Testament to prove unity of authorship. I think this rests on a colossal misunderstanding of pretty much everything, and it just doesn't deal with like masses of evidence on both sides. But I hope I don't sound conceited about that. It's not that I respect the inventiveness. It's just that from my perspective, somebody who works in the material every day, just doesn't answer anything. It doesn't answer any questions. Anyway, so from that point of view, yes, people point that out all the time. But what I would say again is we need some broader perspective on this. Shipwrecks were a common part of ancient travel by ship. People were worried about traveling by ship. It was always a touch and go thing. And you have lots of references in ancient texts. Well, first of all, you have lots of shipwrecks actually in the Mediterranean. There have been lots of shipwrecks. And the whole Alexandria to Rome route was, you had to be very careful when you traveled by ship, for one thing. It was just really a dodgy business. And so you wouldn't usually travel in winter. Sometimes Romans did anyway. They had kind of faster cutter ships that they would risk on winter travel. But generally speaking, sailing season was, from like May to August was best, April to August, because, a sailing ship is a pretty vulnerable vessel. And there are lots of shipwrecks. So people talk about it all the time in letters, in poetry, in historical accounts. Shipwrecks are just part of life. So also you have the shipwreck of Paul in Acts. Yes, absolutely. And Paul mentions being shipwrecked in his letters in Second Corinthians. So like it's pretty common. In fact, I mean, he's shipwrecked more than once. And I think, yeah, it's just so common that I don't think there's any reason to link up those two stories, even though the Acts, I've argued myself that Luke Acts has some dependence on Josephus. You know that
Yeah.
already.
Yeah, maybe we can touch on that a little bit more too on our follow-up for sure.
Yeah. So, but even in that case, I don't think that those two shipwreck stories are particularly telling of anything.
Gotcha. Interesting. I love studying this stuff, and I agree with you. There's a lot of theories, a lot of cool ones. Everything from the Josephus Paul stuff to the Simon Magus stuff to the archons and up in space, and there's a lot of stuff, and some of it has some stuff that you think, especially if you've never heard it before, you think, oh, that sounds kind of weird, it sounds kind of fringe, probably not. But then you actually watch the case, you look at the facts unfold, you're like, huh, there's a little too much there to ignore. Something's fishy. Maybe something actually is here, and it's very interesting. I admit I feel like I'm definitely learning to have a more open mind, which I know you've encouraged me on different subjects. But just having an open mind and letting the final outcome be always open to further interpretation, further facts. And like I joked a little bit ago, who knows? Maybe we'll suddenly find a first century Josephus copy, and wouldn't that be interesting? And all of a sudden, the discussion start over again.
That would be something. Yeah. Yes, that would be wonderful. I remember one of the universities I worked at was a standard question when we would hire somebody for a job, to ask them, out of all the lost texts, what would you like to have? And it's a really interesting question because it, requires them, first of all, to know what a lot of the lost texts are. And yeah, but in this case, of course, it would be the manuscript. It would be the autograph of Josephus. That would be something.
I wanted to end by saying thank you. This has been it's so much meat there. I feel like just like our other videos, I go back to them, and there's so much meat there that I just appreciate that you don't just answer a quick question where it's in and out. Here's yes, no answer, bam, it's done. You're giving background to why you're coming to some of your conclusions, and a lot of meat for us to dig into, and subjects for us to get better educated on ourselves, so we can kind of step away from the discussions and the questions and get more research on our side, and then come back into the discussion and ask better questions, hopefully over time. I definitely have it as a long-term goal of mine to be able to, if I'm interviewing you 3 or 4 years from now, to have hopefully much better questions, and to look back at some of these interviews and say, what was I thinking? What a crazy question. But just to think, that the questions hopefully get refined. And I appreciate that you do an amazing job at putting, a lot of the information that we need to hone in on and focus on. It's really helpful. It's very insightful to me, and I really appreciate it.
It's my great pleasure, and don't ever think that I think they're silly questions. I think they're great questions, and I really welcome the opportunity actually to try to get at the foundations of some of this stuff, because there are just far too many. I mean, for people generally looking at everything that's out there, it's really hard if you don't work in the area to have any kind of criteria. Or, why is that person saying that? Why is that person saying that? So I hope, not that anyone will agree with me particularly, that's neither here nor there, but that people begin to understand what's at stake and why judgments are made. That's the important thing.
Yeah, absolutely. It seems like a good reminder too that and I'll end with this because we've touched on a lot of subjects, but just the idea of not being dogmatic. We those of us who, like myself, have escaped, what I call the Bible prison Christianity. A big part of the issue was this dogmatism of, I know this, and I don't care what you say, you can't convince me. Like, I know the earth is 6,000 years old, end of story. There's nothing you could tell me that would change my mind. And kind of like that infamous Bill Nye, Ken Ham debate, about creation and the question of what would change your mind. And I, if I'm not mistaken, Bill Nye talked about, further information, further research, more facts, something like that. And I think Ken Ham's response was something like, you couldn't. I already know the truth. I know the final statement, and it is X. And just being always having that open mind to say, when there's more research, more information, I'll change my mind, and to take away the dogmatism. And I think too, I love the way that you do that really well, but you also bring in this friendly aspect where you're not trying to say that you've got all the answers. And I think that's what is kind of an outgrowth of some of the dogmatism is people that say, I know that I've got the answers because I know so much. And it's kind of like to redeem maybe a Christian concept, like beware, your pride, because you're going to fall from it. The more you say, I know that I know that I know, and no one can possibly be more right than I am. That's where you put the target on your backside. And it's like, just for us to keep a humility that we don't know a lot of this stuff. We don't have all the documents we want, and we don't know all the history. And who knows, maybe there's a whole bunch of other documents that will be unveiled at some point. Maybe they're probably all sitting in the bottom of the Vatican, but maybe the documents will come to light sometime, and we'll be like, whoa, this changes so much. And thankfully we kept an open mind and said we're open to having our minds changed, and at that point, as opposed to having to put our foot in our mouth, realize we put our foot in our mouth and said so many stupid things just because we were acting in such ignorance. And I definitely appreciate that sense that, as more information comes, we'll flex with it and keep open minds. But thank you so much for doing this. This was really cool. This was a great start to my further understanding of the testimonium.
You're most welcome. And that's what we just said. If I can encapsulate it, the biggest, I'm a historian, the only kind of challenge of a historian is to explain evidence. Whatever problem it is we're looking at, okay, like a detective, what's the evidence? What's the best explanation of it? That's it. And so you can't get caught up in a particular conclusion or theory of it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so thank you, Tim, and thank you for observing that, because that's quite an important point in my work. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, I can't wait. I'll be honing these questions. I look forward to the next time, but thank you so much for doing this today. I really appreciate it.
Okay, thanks, Tim.
Thank you.
Bye.